In a sun-scorched corner of the American Southwest, a quiet ranch stands at the center of a ruthless land grab. A high-power development firm believes they've cornered an aging widow, easy prey for their backroom deals and hired guns. But they couldn't be more wrong. Because Margaret Barrett isn't alone. Standing behind her is a man whose very name was whispered on classified battlefields around the globe, a veteran of the darkest corners of modern warfare, her son. For over 2 decades, he led covert operations that never made the evening news. Call him a ghost, a myth, a shadow that vanished before his enemies knew he was there. And when this corporation brings their mercenaries to seize the Barrett land, they're about to discover that some old soldiers never lose their edge. What follows is a high-stakes showdown on the dusty plains, an unstoppable force of modern profiteers colliding head-on with a battle-tested operative who knows every trick in the book. This isn't just another land dispute. It's a war waged by one family's unbreakable will and the lethal skills that built a legend. Quick pause before we continue. Welcome to Fabled Frames. Please tell us where you are watching from. Don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story is mind-blowing. The last of the day's light burned orange across the dry fields of the Barrett Ranch, bathing the worn barn, the rotting fence posts, and the dusty cattle in the glow of twilight. 72-year-old Margaret Barrett stood on her porch, leaning on a battered cane. Every bone in her body ached, but she had no intention of moving an inch. This ranch had been in her family for 4 generations, carved out of the tough southwestern soil by her great-grandparents. She was determined it would stay in the Barrett name until her final day. Beneath her wide-brimmed straw hat, her gray hair lay in 2 thin braids, each one telling the story of years spent under a harsh sun. Her skin, weathered by time, stretched taut across proud cheekbones. Despite her age, her iron will was legendary in these parts. Locals still recalled how she single-handedly fended off rustlers in her youth, or how she survived the worst drought in memory with a mixture of grit and faith. Now a new threat loomed on the horizon, not nature, not bandits, but a corporation known as Red Cliffs Development. 2 men in tailored suits had visited earlier that afternoon. They'd offered her a thick envelope stuffed with money, kindness, they'd called it, so she could leave peacefully. What had begun as polite negotiation quickly turned to veiled threats when Margaret refused their offer. They wanted her land for something big, a sprawling resort, complete with a private golf course and luxury cabins. She'd seen the plans they dangled in front of her. The idea of turning her family's legacy into a playground for wealthy tourists made her blood boil. She had politely declined, as was her way. Then, after they kept pushing, she'd shown them the business end of her shotgun. "I'm not for sale," she'd stated, her voice a low growl. They left with tight smiles, but she saw the hatred simmering in their eyes. Margaret had spent the rest of the day feeling an uneasy energy crawling up her spine. She suspected that Red Cliffs Development wouldn't give up so easily. Indeed, no sooner had the men driven off than a black SUV passed down the dirt road running along her fence line. She recognized the vehicle, or at least the type. Tinted windows and government plates were not common around this part of the county. She knew it was no coincidence. Big money always came with big friends, sometimes the kind that wore badges, sometimes the kind that didn't bother with them. Margaret's grip tightened around her cane, her rheumatic knee screaming for relief. She cast a lingering glance at the dusty ranch yard. A few cattle milled near the water trough, but she was keenly aware that her herd was dwindling. At her age, and with her persistent pain, she struggled to maintain the place. Most of her ranch hands had found steadier or easier work. She had only Hank, a middle-aged neighbor, who came by twice a week to check on her and mend fences. Squinting at the darkening skyline, she muttered, "Henry Barrett, I wish you were still here." Her late husband had passed on nearly a decade earlier, leaving her with both the burdens and the blessings of the ranch. He'd always been the quieter of the two, but in life, he had offered a steady presence that could calm even the fiercest storms. In the gathering dusk, she considered the possibility of calling her son Lucas. She hadn't spoken to him in several years. He had left home at 19 to join the military, and what came after he left the service she only understood in vague terms. Covert missions, black ops, moral lines that might have been crossed. Their conversations grew more infrequent until they vanished. A dispute about personal choices, an argument about how he was changing. Now, with darkness closing in and a heavy weight of corporate threats looming, Margaret felt her pride waver. She had no illusions about her age or her capacity to fend off an organized attack. If anyone could protect this ranch from a more sinister force, it might be the man who had seen the darkest corners of the world. But calling him would mean swallowing her pride, and she wasn't sure how that conversation would go, or how he'd respond if he saw how frail she'd become. Just then, thunder rumbled in the distant sky, but there were no clouds for miles around. It wasn't nature's voice. It was something else, maybe gunfire. Margaret's heart pounded. She scanned the perimeter of her fence line, but saw no immediate intruders. Still, the sound echoed, leaving her unsettled. The developers were beginning to make their presence known, she was sure of it. She took one last look at the horizon and turned to limp inside. Under the harsh light of a single bulb in her living room, she reached for the phone. A battered phone book lay open on an end table, pages dog-eared and yellowed from decades of use. With a trembling hand, she flipped to the B section and found her son's name scrawled in her neat handwriting. She had only changed the number once a few years back and had carefully written it down. Her heart hammered as she lifted the receiver. She tapped in the number, half hoping he wouldn't pick up, half praying he would. When she heard a dull ring at the other end, she held her breath. The ring continued for a disconcerting stretch of time. She was about to hang up, tears threatening to cloud her eyes, when the line clicked. A gruff voice said, "Yeah." Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "Hello," the voice repeated, sounding impatient, maybe even cautious. Finally, she summoned enough courage to whisper, "Lucas, it's your mother." But the words got stuck in her throat. She wasn't even sure what to say next, how to mend years of distance in a single call. Before she could figure out the right words, a sudden crash reverberated through her kitchen window. Glass shattered, and the lights flickered. Margaret whirled around, nearly dropping the phone. Adrenaline surged through her frail frame. Someone was outside, or maybe more than one. Her sense of dread turned to outright alarm. "Ma." Lucas's voice on the phone rose in urgency, but Margaret could hardly process his words. She hobbled toward the back door with her cane, fear gripping every nerve in her body. She didn't realize she'd left the phone dangling until she heard her son's voice crackling in the distance. In her kitchen, the window was indeed broken, shards scattered across the countertop. A cold breeze blew in. Outside, she thought she saw a shape dart into the darkness. She reached for her shotgun, the only source of comfort she had left. Clutching the weapon, she trembled, trying to muster the energy to shout into the night. All she heard was her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She knew that if Red Cliff's development was making a move, it had begun. All she could hope was that Lucas, somewhere on the other end of that phone line, would come back to a place he once called home. She kept the shotgun trained on the shattered window. Her grip was sweaty, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and grit. Then came a second crash, this time from the front porch. Margaret spun, shotgun at the ready, silently praying this nightmare would end before it truly began. Yet in her heart she knew it was only the start of something far more dangerous. Meanwhile, several hours away, Lucas Barrett sat on a rusted metal chair in a dimly lit storage unit. The place was more of a bunker than a rental space, piled high with sealed crates and black duffel bags. Weapons, ammunition, specialized gear. The air smelled of gun oil and stale sweat. He'd spent the better part of his adult life in windowless rooms, too many to count, but none felt as suffocating as his own regrets. His phone buzzed. He nearly dismissed it out of habit. Lucas had built a life on ignoring calls, wanted that when living on the edges of the law. But something compelled him to glance at the screen. The display showed a number he'd memorized but never dialed. It was the ranch. His mother. His pulse quickened. After all these years, why now? He didn't want to answer because hearing her voice would dredge up old memories, Christmas dinners, heated arguments, and the day he left. But in the end, his instincts were too honed to let him ignore something so unusual. Lifting the phone to his ear, he rasped, "Yeah?" He heard his mother's voice quivering. She'd barely said his name when he caught the clatter of breaking glass in the background. By the time he realized something was terribly wrong, the phone clattered and went silent, or so it seemed. All he could pick up was distant rustling and the hollow echo of his mother's terrified breathing. "Ma? Ma?" Lucas shouted into the phone, but there was no response. Every second felt like an eternity. He had no plan, no direction, just a surge of protectiveness roaring through him like wildfire. His training kicked in. Stay calm, gather data. He strained to hear more through the phone's static. The line was still open, faint noises drifting in. A dull thud, perhaps the sound of a door. Could be footsteps or the rustle of someone climbing through a broken window. His mother's ragged breathing interspersed with a distant rumble. Maybe voices. Definitely tension. Whatever was going on back at the ranch, it was bad. He had no doubt. He grabbed the black duffel nearest him and unzipped it. Inside lay a disassembled pistol, extra magazines, a combat knife, and a small med kit. Everything he might need in an emergency. He quickly tossed in an additional stash of gear, a compact assault rifle with a foldable stock, night vision goggles, and a bulletproof vest with minimal plating, things designed for in-and-out operations, not prolonged warfare. Still, they would have to do. The phone line suddenly went dead. The abrupt silence was more horrifying than the noises of violence. Lucas's stomach twisted. He tossed the phone aside, slung the duffel across his shoulder, and sprinted out to his battered SUV. It was a relic of his previous life, windows tinted, engine reinforced, discreet but deadly if called upon. Sliding behind the wheel, he started the ignition, tires screeching as he pulled onto the highway. He hadn't been back to the ranch in years, but he could have navigated every back road and dusty trail with his eyes closed. Guilt gnawed at him. What if something had happened to her, and all this time he'd been too proud or too afraid to make amends? Now a cold dread told him this situation was bigger than a simple home invasion. If his mother needed him, it meant real trouble had come knocking. As he sped into the night, the neon lights of the city receded in the rearview mirror. Ahead stretched miles of darkness, broken only by the faint glow of scatter houses and the occasional passing truck. He mentally rehearsed everything he knew about the ranch's layout. He imagined vantage points, chokeholds, the best places to hide in a firefight. The possibility that corporate muscle might be behind this only made him more certain of what he had to do. He had once been an elite soldier, a ghost who slipped behind enemy lines. Now he would be that ghost again, but this time for his family. An hour into the drive, the sky opened up in a drizzling rain, as if foreshadowing the grimness to come. He rarely allowed emotions to cloud his mind, but the thought of his mother alone, frightened, maybe injured, made his heart hammer with an urgency he hadn't felt since his final, fateful mission overseas. He tried calling the ranch phone several times, but no one answered. He wanted to believe the line was just damaged, that maybe she was safe, holed up in a locked room with a shotgun. In the best of times, Margaret Barrett was a formidable woman who could outstare a rattlesnake. Still, that mental image didn't ease the sense of doom creeping over him. Hours later, the drizzling rain tapered off, leaving the moonlight reflecting dully on the wet asphalt. The turnoff to the ranch beckoned. An old gravel road flanked by desert shrubs and farmland left fallow under the developer's looming presence. As he inched closer, his headlights caught a sign riddled with bullet holes, Barrett Ranch. A second sign, smaller and newer, read future home of Red Cliffs Resort, with bright yellow stenciling. Lucas swore under his breath. The ranch entrance gate was swung wide open. That alone was alarming. Margaret was vigilant about keeping it locked. He killed his headlights and rolled forward, adrenaline rising. In the pale moonlight, the ranch house came into view, windows dark, porch light shattered. It was unnaturally silent, the crickets and night owls seemingly absent. Or perhaps the weight of fear had just dulled his senses. He parked the SUV behind a stand of mesquite trees. From there, he grabbed his duffel, strapped on his gear, and surveyed the area. No movement. No signs of a struggle, but the tension was thick as a storm cloud. With careful, silent steps, he approached the house. Shattered glass crunched softly under his boots. The front porch light flickered feebly, as if it hadn't fully given up. The door stood ajar, a faint gust of wind causing it to creak on its hinges. Stepping inside, he found the living room in disarray. The phone was off the hook, cords stretched across the room. There was a smear of blood on the wall near a shattered picture frame, his mother's wedding photo. Lucas's stomach lurched, but he forced himself to remain calm. A quick search of the house yielded no immediate sign of his mother. No bodies, no kidnappers waiting in ambush. The back window was indeed smashed, allowing a draft of cold night air to swirl through the kitchen. The only clue was an overturned chair and fresh footprints leading away from the house into the darkness beyond. Lucas paused at the threshold, scanning for additional footprints or tire tracks. Moonlight illuminated 2 sets, maybe 3. One pair was smaller, possibly Margaret's. The other footprints were heavier, made by someone wearing thick-soled boots. The prints disappeared around the corner of the house. Was it an abduction? A fight? He didn't know for certain, only that the threat had come, and his mother was nowhere to be found. Then a strangled cry echoed through the yard. Lucas spun, weapon at the ready. The sound came from somewhere near the barn. Every muscle tensed as he dashed across the open ground, using every ounce of stealth training he had. His footsteps were nearly silent on the damp earth. He reached the barn, heart hammering in his chest, and glimpsed a faint flicker of movement inside. The front door was partly open, swaying gently. Taking a steadying breath, he readied his rifle. If someone had harmed Margaret, they'd pay dearly. But as he slipped into the barn's shadowy interior, a single jolt of realization tore through him. He might be walking straight into a trap. Still, retreat was not an option. A loud crash rang out behind Lucas. The barn door slammed shut, and darkness swallowed him whole. Margaret shuddered, bound to a wooden chair in what looked like a dusty storage room adjacent to the barn. Her wrists were red and raw from struggling against the coarse rope. A single incandescent bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting jittery shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Her shotgun had been kicked away in the initial scuffle. The intruder's boots had crunched over the shards of broken window glass, and one of them had covered her mouth before she could shout for help. She had only gotten glimpses of her attackers, 2 men, big and bristling with impatience. Each wore dark clothing, the kind that masked muscle and intimidation behind an unremarkable facade. Their eyes, however, were filled with arrogance, a certainty that they could do whatever they wanted without consequence. She tested the rope again. No gift. Her right knee throbbed, a bruise forming from where she'd been forced into the chair. Despite the pain, anger burned within her. She was Margaret Barrett, and no corporate thug was going to scare her off her land. If they thought otherwise, they hadn't done their homework. One of the men, the taller of the two, paced near an old table strewn with rusted tools. A half-empty water bottle sat beside him. He stopped occasionally to glare at her like a predator sizing up its wounded prey. The other, with close-cropped blonde hair, knelt in front of Margaret, a mock sympathy in his eyes. "We don't want to hurt you," blonde hair said, voice dripping with condescension. "Red Cliffs wants to handle this like professionals. But you forced our hand." "Go to hell," Margaret spat, though the words came out more tremulous than she intended. The taller man sneered. "Lady, you're on borrowed time. We made a generous offer, and you refused to be reasonable. Now you're going to sign those papers, or we're taking them out of your cold, dead hands." Margaret's stomach churned, not just from fear, but from a rabid contempt for their arrogance. The threat was all too real. These men were ready to kill if it meant securing the land. Her mind drifted to Lucas. Had he heard the noise on the phone? Would he come? She knew he was no stranger to danger. His time in the military had seen to that. If he arrived, she hoped it would be soon. Blonde Hair lifted a legal document from his pocket, brandishing it as though it were a weapon. "We just need your signature," he said casually, "and this can end. You'll be properly compensated. You can go on living your golden years in comfort. But if you keep resisting—" Margaret glared. She wasn't sure whether to laugh at the audacity or scream. "My family built this ranch. I'm not giving it up for any price." The taller thug snatched the document from his partner's hand and slammed it on the table. "This is your last warning," he growled. "After tonight, Red Cliffs is done playing nice. We've got the county commissioners in our pocket. We've got the sheriff, too. All we need is your name on the dotted line, or the next time your neighbors see, you will be in a casket." Margaret said nothing, letting silence be her shield. She hated that her voice wavered, that her body betrayed her fear in small tremors. But her spirit remained unyielding. She locked eyes with the men, a silent act of defiance. Minutes ticked by. The taller man resumed pacing, occasionally glancing at his phone. "Where the hell are those reinforcements?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Blonde Hair leaned close to Margaret again, his breath sour. "Word is, your son's a trained killer. A special ops type. Let's hope for your sake he doesn't show up, because we've got a few skilled operators of our own." Margaret's eyes widened involuntarily. They knew about Lucas. How? She realized that her son's name might have appeared in old ranch records or maybe the local gossip. If they were well funded, they could have easily gleaned that intel from the county courthouse or by paying someone off. Yet part of her felt a glimmer of hope. If they were worried about Lucas, maybe he could even the odds. Then again, the thought of him plunging into danger on her behalf made her heart clench in dread. She didn't want him killing or getting killed. She wanted to protect him as fiercely as he would protect her. A sudden commotion in the barn made both men freeze. The sound of the door slamming, followed by hushed cursing. The taller man reached for his sidearm, motioning for Blonde Hair to stay put. With careful steps, he approached the closed door leading to the barn's main area. He pressed an ear against it, listening intently. Margaret's pulse raced. Could it be Lucas? She prayed it was. Yet at the same time, the men were armed, and they might also have backup outside. If Lucas was out there, he might be walking straight into an ambush. Blonde Hair leaned in closer, grabbing Margaret's chin roughly. He whispered, "If that's your boy, you'd better hope he's smart enough to walk away. Otherwise, we'll bury him alongside his dear mommy." Margaret wanted to smash her forehead into the man's smug face, but the ropes held her tight. Still, she managed one act of resistance. She spat in his face. He recoiled, wiping his cheek with the back of his hand, eyes blazing with fury. "You're going to regret that, old hag," he hissed. Through the walls, something clattered loudly, like metal crashing to the floor. The taller thug spun the knob, inches from opening the door. Then a sudden pop and crack rang out, a gunshot, maybe suppressed. The man stumbled back, cursing in agony, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped through his fingers. Both Margaret and Blonde Hair stared, adrenaline surging in their veins. The shot had come from beyond the door, but who fired it? The memory of Lucas's calm, steady aim filled Margaret's mind. The taller thug, eyes bulging with pain, managed to stay upright. He hissed through clenched teeth, "He's here." Blonde Hair released Margaret's chin and darted to the door, drawing his weapon. He and his wounded partner exchanged a quick, meaningful glance. They might be outmatched, but they had Margaret hostage. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream for Lucas to stay back, to avoid risking his life. But one of the men brandished his pistol toward her, a silent warning to keep quiet. She closed her eyes, tears threatening to spill. If Lucas was truly here, he had to be careful. Red Cliffs wouldn't send amateurs. They were likely ex-military or mercenaries, men used to black market deals, intimidation, and lethal tactics. In the hush that followed, Margaret's heart pounded like a drum. The overhead light flickered ominously. She could hear faint footsteps on the other side of the door, methodical and stealthy. Even if she couldn't see her son, she could sense his presence. A tension electrified the air. She dared to pray. Lucas, be safe. The door suddenly burst inward in an explosion of splintered wood, throwing the men off balance as a dark figure lunged through the haze. Lucas swept into the room in a flurry of precise motion. The door had been rigged with a small charge, an improvised flashbang he'd thrown together from his tactical kit in under a minute. The explosion wasn't massive, but it served its purpose, sending the door inward and disorienting whoever stood behind it. Caught off guard, both thugs scrambled. The taller one, already bleeding from a shoulder wound, snarled and tried to raise his pistol, but Lucas was faster. With a swift pivot, he slammed the butt of his rifle into the man's wrist. The gun tumbled away, clattering under a bench. Blonde Hair fired 2 frantic shots, bullets biting into the splintered doorframe, chips of wood flying. Lucas rolled across the floor, evading the line of fire, and came up behind an old metal cabinet. His heart hammered, adrenaline coursed hot in his veins, but his mind was razor-sharp, honed by years of close-quarters combat. "Lucas!" Margaret screamed, half in warning, half in relief, as she caught sight of him through the smoke and chaos. He risked a quick glance at her. She was bound, eyes wide with concern, but alive. That single confirmation fueled his resolve. He crouched low, rifle at the ready, scanning the cramped space. The overhead bulb swayed, casting eerie shadows. The pungent odor of gunpowder hung in the air. Blonde Hair ducked behind a large wooden crate, reloading with trembling hands. The wounded thug, pinned against the wall, fumbled for a secondary weapon, a knife strapped to his belt. Lucas exhaled slowly, focusing. He had limited space to maneuver, but his training emphasized controlling the environment. He grabbed a loose piece of pipe from a nearby shelf and, with calculated force, chucked it across the room. The clang drew Blonde Hair's attention, prompting him to fire reflexively, emptying more rounds into the shadows. The muzzle flashes lit up the room in brief strobes. Using the distraction, Lucas burst from cover, angled his rifle, and placed a shot square in Blonde Hair's shoulder. The man yelped, dropping his gun as he collapsed against the crate. He clutched at the wound, face etched in agony and disbelief. The wounded thug by the wall let out a roar and lunged at Lucas with a knife. In a fluid motion, Lucas sidestepped, deflected the incoming slash with the barrel of his rifle, and countered with a brutal elbow strike to the side of the thug's head. The blow connected with a sickening thud, and the man crumpled to the ground. It was over in seconds, the 2 men incapacitated, moaning in pain. Lucas trained his rifle on them, breathing hard, refusing to let his guard drop. One of them attempted to crawl toward the fallen pistol, but a swift stomp from Lucas put an end to that notion. "Don't," he warned, voice low and lethal. His gaze flickered to Margaret, the intensity in his eyes softening for a fleeting moment. She was alive. That was all that mattered. With the men effectively disarmed, he kicked their weapons out of reach. Then he hurried to his mother's side, heart twisting at the sight of her bound to that chair, lips quivering, hair disheveled. Blood stained her sleeve where she had been manhandled. "You're hurt," he said, kneeling to inspect her. His voice came out raw, as if he'd swallowed shards of glass. She shook her head. "I'm all right." "Just untie me," she rasped, blinking back tears. Lucas whipped out a tactical knife and carefully sawed through the ropes. The moment her hands were free, she clasped his face with trembling fingers, studying him as if unsure he was real. In that instant, their years of estrangement collapsed. All that remained was a mother relieved to see her son alive and whole, and a son who'd arrived just in time. He helped her stand, supporting her frail body as she wobbled. The anger in her eyes was overshadowed by exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. Lucas nodded, But their reunion was cut short by a pained chuckle from blonde hair, who still clutched his bleeding shoulder. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," the man rasped. "We're just the beginning." Lucas glared at him. "Who else is coming?" he demanded. The thug coughed, smirking even through the pain. "Call it a larger force. Red Cliffs doesn't like to lose. They'll flatten this ranch and everyone on it." Margaret bristled, stepping toward him. Lucas placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. The older woman was visibly shaken, but her courage resurfaced. "I won't let them take this land," she stated, voice quivering with resolved fury. "Not now, not ever." The thug's laughter turned bitter. "Your son can't protect you forever, old woman. And when he fails, you'll wish you'd sold us the deed." Lucas's expression darkened. He considered delivering another disabling blow, but found it unnecessary. The men were no immediate threat, and the real challenge lay beyond them. He quickly scanned the room, noticing a cell phone on a floor, likely belonging to one of the attackers. He scooped it up, flipping it open to check recent messages. They confirmed what he feared. Reinforcements were en route. He turned to Margaret. "We need to get you to safety." She shook her head firmly, a flash of her old stubbornness. "If we leave, they'll just take the ranch. Henry Barrett didn't raise a coward, and I'm not about to let these scum run me off my property." Lucas clenched his jaw. He understood her sentiment, but he also knew the tactics of an organized assault. "At least let me scout the perimeter and secure the house. If more of them are coming, we'll need every advantage." Margaret nodded, leaning heavily on him for support. He guided her out of the storage room. Behind them, the men groaned in agony, pinned by injuries but very much alive. Lucas paused, flipping off the bare light bulb, plunging them into darkness. Out in the barn, the night air felt eerily calm compared to the violent scene they just escaped. Margaret's knees buckled as they walked, and Lucas was there to steady her, carefully adjusting his grip. As they passed the barn door, she gave him a weary smile. "I knew you'd come," she said quietly. He swallowed, uncertain how to respond to that. Memories flickered, the arguments, the pride, the guilt. But now wasn't the time for apologies or confessions. Now was the time to strategize. Halfway across the yard, they heard the distant rumble of multiple engines. Headlights bobbed along the main road, approaching at a menacing pace. Lucas stopped, scanning the horizon. The dust kicked up by the vehicles glowed in the moonlight, a warning sign of the next wave. He grabbed Margaret's hand, leading her toward the ranch house. "We need cover," he whispered. She nodded, and they slipped inside, careful not to make noise. The front windows had been shattered, glass crunched underfoot. Lucas guided Margaret to the safest corner of the living room, an area that offered the best visibility of the front yard while providing some protection from stray bullets. Engine noises grew louder until they were right outside. Through a gap in the curtains, Lucas spotted at least 3 SUVs rolling to a stop near the fence. Shadows emerged, men with guns and flashlights cutting through the dark. A flurry of movement indicated more than half a dozen armed people. The phone in his pocket buzzed. He realized it was one of the attackers' phones, the screen lighting up with an incoming call. Margaret looked at him, her eyes silently asking what they should do next. Before Lucas could answer, the unmistakable crack of gunfire split the night, bullets riddling the side of the house. Wood splintered, plaster dust filled the air, and the entire house seemed to groan under the barrage of bullets. Lucas shoved Margaret down, shielding her with his own body as they crouched behind an overturned sofa. The stench of gunpowder wafted through the shattered windows. For a moment, a fierce ringing seized Lucas's ears. Margaret clutched his arm, face pale but determined. He pressed a finger to his lips, urging silence, and she nodded. Despite the chaos, she steadied her breathing. She lived her entire life surrounded by danger, from wild animals to violent storms, but never had she faced an organized assault like this. A lull came in the gunfire. In that brief window, Lucas risked a glance over the couch. Through a gap in the splintered wood, he saw at least 8 men fanning out, using the vehicles for cover. Their weapons glinted under the faint moonlight, and the tension in the air felt like a coiled viper. Some shouted commands, referencing, suppressing fire in advance. These weren't just random thugs. They moved with tactical precision. Lucas's mind raced. He had the advantage of knowing every inch of the ranch, but they had superior numbers and firepower. Moreover, they'd likely cut off any easy escape routes. He needed to switch from defense to offense, or at least find a way to deter them until help could arrive. Yet, who could they count on? The local sheriff? If what those mercenaries claimed was true, the sheriff might be in Redcliffe's pocket. Margaret tugged on his sleeve, motioning for him to lean closer. Hank might be coming, she whispered, referring to their neighbor who sometimes helped out. He's got a radio in his truck. I spoke to him yesterday. He said he'd check on me tonight. Lucas nodded. A single ally was better than nothing, though he didn't want to pin too many hopes on a neighbor who might not be ready for a firefight of this scale. Still, the possibility of backup fueled a kernel of hope. Meanwhile, the assailants started closing in, flashlights bobbing across the yard. The muzzle flash of one operative's weapon lit the night, peppering the house's windows with another burst of bullets. Glass shattered anew. Lucas motioned for Margaret to crawl deeper into the hallway, away from the direct line of fire. He followed, inching along the floor with his assault rifle slung across his chest, every nerve on edge. Somewhere outside, a voice boomed, "Come out, Barrett. This doesn't have to get any uglier. Sign over the ranch, and we walk away. Otherwise, you and your mother end up like your pals in the barn." Lucas exhaled slowly. He had to assume they'd found the injured men, or at least discovered the aftermath. That might provoke them to be more aggressive. Negotiation was unlikely to work unless he showed he was willing to fight back. "Lucas," Margaret whispered, "there's a hidden rifle behind the pantry wall in the kitchen. Belonged to your father. Might come in handy if we need extra firepower." He nodded, guiding her to a small closet for cover. "Stay here, keep down, and don't move unless you have to. If anyone comes through that door that isn't me, shoot." He pressed his backup pistol into her trembling hands. Her eyes watered, but she set her jaw and nodded. Lucas then crept toward the kitchen, weapon at the ready. The floorboards creaked despite his careful steps. His vision adjusted to the dim interior, aided by the moonbeams filtering through the bullet holes in the walls. He reached the pantry and felt along the back for a latch. His fingers found it, and with a gentle tug, a section of the wall slid open, revealing an old hunting rifle and a box of .30-30 rounds. He tested the rifle's bolt action, stiff, but still functional. Outside, he heard footsteps on the porch. Muffled orders. They were moving in. Gripping the rifle, Lucas darted to the side window, half concealed by drooping curtains. He lifted the sash carefully, just enough to peer out. A figure clad in dark tactical gear climbed the steps. Another scanned the yard, covering the approach. With a slow, deliberate breath, Lucas steadied the rifle on the windowsill. He focused on the porch intruder, centering the reticle on the man's chest. Though Lucas had performed countless takedowns in war zones, shooting an armed intruder on his family's porch carried a different weight. But he had no choice if he intended to protect his mother. He fired. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. The man crumpled with a shocked grunt. Shouts erupted outside, and another hail of bullets pounded the house. Lucas ducked, shielding his face as plaster rained from the ceiling. He chambered another round, heart pounding in a near-deafening rhythm. A second operative charged up the porch steps, returning fire through the window. Lucas rolled away just in time, landing behind the kitchen island. Bullets tore into the wooden cabinetry, sending splinters flying. He heard boots on the porch floorboards, the door handle rattling. From his vantage point, he had a clear shot at the silhouette standing at the threshold. He squeezed the trigger. The figure jerked backward, arms flailing, weapon firing wildly into the night before clattering to the ground. A scream from outside signaled another wounded assailant, possibly hit by friendly fire in the confusion. But more footsteps rumbled across the dirt yard. They were pouring in, probably splitting into teams to flank the house. Lucas's mind raced, trying to recall if the attackers from the barn had managed to radio for reinforcements. He suspected they had. He crawled back to check on Margaret. She stayed crouched behind the closet door, pistol clutched in both hands. The fear in her eyes was matched only by a fierce determination. "Two down on the porch," Lucas whispered. "But more are circling. We need a better position." She nodded, motioning toward the stairwell that led to the second floor. "We can see them better from your old bedroom window," she said, referencing the vantage point that overlooked most of the ranch yard. Before they could move, the phone in Lucas's pocket buzzed again, the mercenaries' phone. The display read bus. He contemplated ignoring it but changed his mind. Maybe he could buy some time or gather intel. He pressed answer without speaking, letting the line stay silent. A voice snapped through the earpiece, gravelly and urgent. "Report. Is the target secured? I hear gunfire. Do you need backup? Over." Lucas remained quiet, letting the tension mount. Silence might bait them into revealing their position or plan. Eventually, the voice barked again. "God damn it, respond or we move in with heavy artillery. We're done playing." So they were holding back a heavier arsenal. Lucas's pulse hammered. He ended the call abruptly, knowing if he said anything, it might tip them off that their men were compromised. For now, he'd keep them guessing. He signaled to Margaret, pointing toward the stairs. She nodded, and together they crawled, keeping low. The house groaned again as more bullets hammered its walls, but the gunfire had slowed. Perhaps the attackers realized charging straight in was a losing strategy. They reached the second-floor landing. Lucas's old bedroom door hung ajar, revealing a space mostly untouched since he left. Posters of military jets, a dusty bookshelf. The window offered a commanding view of the yard and the dirt road beyond. Lucas propped the hunting rifle on the windowsill, scanning the darkness. Several flashlights darted among the outbuildings and vehicles. One SUV's headlights were still on, illuminating a corridor of dust motes. He counted 6 figures moving in a pincer formation, 3 on each side of the yard. Margaret took a shaky breath at his side. "How many more can there be?" she whispered. "Enough," he replied tersely. "This is bigger than a couple of goons. Red Cliffs has deep pockets." He zeroed in on a shadow creeping along the barn's side. Timing his breath, he squeezed the trigger. The figure recoiled, collapsed. Instantly, muzzle flashes lit up from near the barn, bullets ricocheting off the house's siding. Margaret flinched, but she kept her cool. "I can reload for you," she offered, her voice trembling but resolute. He handed her the spare ammo. She had trouble with her hands, shaking from either pain or adrenaline, but she managed to place the cartridges by his side. Lucas chambered another round. The next shot went wide, pinging off the corner of a tractor. He cursed under his breath. Suddenly, a set of headlights flared in the distance, another vehicle approaching at a fast clip. Lucas tensed, expecting more mercenaries. But the pickup truck that swerved onto the ranch yard was old, battered, and very familiar. Margaret's eyes lit up. "Hank," she breathed. A deafening roar as the pickup's engine revved cut through the night, leaving Lucas and Margaret unsure if Hank's arrival would turn the tide or feed more bodies into the chaos. Hank's old pickup careened through the yard, fishtailing across the dusty ground. The bright headlights momentarily blinded the assailants crouched behind their SUVs. Lucas watched from the second-floor window as Hank slammed the brakes, truck swerving to a stop in a cloud of grit. From inside the cab, Hank leaned out, rifle in hand, shouting, "Margaret, you in there?" His voice carried a note of desperation. One of the Red Cliffs operatives opened fire on the truck. Bullets ricocheted off the hood with a series of metallic pings. Hank ducked, returning a volley of shots that forced the gunman to retreat behind an SUV. "He's going to get himself killed," Margaret murmured, voice strangled by worry. Lucas's mind churned. On one hand, Hank's unexpected arrival drew some of the attackers' attention away from House. On the other, Hank lacked the tactical training these mercenaries had. Unless they coordinated, they'd remain outnumbered and vulnerable. "Stay down," Lucas ordered Margaret. He slung the hunting rifle across his back, grabbed his assault rifle, and bounded down the stairs 2 at a time. He knew the old place had a side entrance near the kitchen that opened onto the yard. If he slipped out unseen, he might flank the operatives pinned down by Hank's gunfire. Margaret rose halfway, as if to follow, but he waved her back. The worry etched on her face toward him, but she nodded, pressing herself against the wall. Lucas reached the side door, carefully pushing it open. The yard was darker here, the porch light shattered in the earlier firefight. He crouched in the shadows, scanning for movement. The chaotic interplay of headlights and muzzle flashes revealed 3 assailants huddled near the barn, 2 more by the SUVs exchanging fire with Hank. Taking advantage of their focus on the pickup, Lucas sprinted to the cover of an old cattle feeder. He glimpsed Hank in the truck, firing sporadic bursts from his lever-action rifle. The muzzle flashes illuminated Hank's tense features. He seemed determined, if not entirely sure how to handle multiple armed aggressors. Lucas steadied his assault rifle on the feeder, took aim at one of the men near the SUVs, and fired. The operative dropped, weapon clattering to the ground. Another spun, trying to locate the source of the shot, and Lucas unleashed a controlled burst that forced him to dive for cover. Hank seized the opportunity, revving the truck's engine, lurching forward. The front bumper collided with one of the SUVs, crunching metal in a horrendous squeal. The SUV rocked sideways, blocking the line of fire for the men behind it. Hank leaned out of the cab, pumping another round into his rifle, eyes darting anxiously. "Who the hell is that?" one of the mercenaries yelled over the roar of the engine. Lucas fired again, wounding a second attacker. "It's over," he shouted, though he doubted they'd surrender easily. The men near the barn realized they were flanked. 2 began circling wide, presumably to corner Lucas. Another retreated behind a stack of hay bales, muzzle flashing as he returned fire. The bullets thudded into the feeder, sending sparks and shards of rusted metal flying. Despite the heavy gunfire, Lucas's mind was clear. He knew every inch of this ranch and recognized potential choke points. Beyond the barn stood an irrigation ditch that could provide a flanking route, but it also left him exposed if someone else took notice. A whoosh overhead made him duck. A flare soared into the sky, fired from somewhere behind the barn. It lit up the yard in harsh white light, turning night into a scene of stark shadows. The sudden brightness disoriented Lucas momentarily. He realized the enemy was trying to remove the advantage of darkness, making it easier for them to spot him and Hank. Hank cowered behind his pickup truck, shielding his eyes from the glare. One of the mercenaries used the moment to rush forward, sidearms spitting bullets. Several shots punched into the truck's door. Hank grimaced, likely hit by ricochet or debris, but he kept firing. His rifle's lever action clacked with each shot, showing a gritty resolve that surprised Lucas. Lucas slid around the edge of the feeder, switching to controlled 3-round bursts. He targeted the man with the flare gun, forcing him behind a tractor. The sudden onslaught of bullets made it clear to the operatives they were facing at least 2 capable shooters. Yet they kept pressing, loyal to their paycheck or perhaps just dangerously well-trained. Over the din, Lucas heard a faint crash from the house. Fear seized his chest. He left Margaret alone upstairs. Had one of the mercenaries slipped inside? Worse yet, had the men he left wounded in the barn revived and come looking for vengeance? He clenched his teeth. He couldn't leave Hank to fend off the assault alone, but he also couldn't abandon Margaret. For a heartbeat, he was torn between loyalty to blood and the pressing need to maintain a tactical advantage. Then his mother's voice echoed in his memory. She wasn't leaving. She would fight for her land, and so would he. Deciding swiftly, Lucas motioned to Hank, whose eyes locked on him across the yard. Lucas tapped his chest, then gestured to the house, signaling he was going back to check on Margaret. Hank gave a tight nod of understanding, reloading frantically. With the flares still illuminating the yard, Lucas sprinted for the side entrance. Bullets whizzed by, kicking up clouds of dust. One tore through the sleeve of his jacket, barely missing flesh. He gritted his teeth and kept moving, adrenaline fueling each stride. He crashed through the door into the kitchen, assault rifle raised. The house felt eerily quiet despite the chaos outside. Bits of plaster rained from fresh bullet holes, the stink of cordite lingering in every room. "Ma," he called softly, inching toward the stairs. Silence answered him, broken only by distant gunfire. Cautiously, he climbed to the second floor, scanning each step. The old wood creaked, but no ambush awaited him. When he reached the hallway, he saw the closet door open, bullet holes in the walls. Margaret was gone. Panic clenched his gut. Had someone taken her? The trail of blood droplets led down the hall, faint but visible in the flicker of the overhead light. He followed, heart pounding, until he reached a small bedroom at the end of the corridor, the same room that once belonged to a ranch hand decades ago. The door was cracked open, a glow emanating from inside. Lucas nudged it with his boot. His finger tightened on the trigger, prepared for a hostile. Instead, he found Margaret slumped against the bed, cradling a pistol in her lap. She gasped when she saw him, relief flooding her features. He rushed to her side, noticing a gash on her forehead. Blood smeared her hairline. "What happened?" he asked, scanning for other injuries. She lifted a shaky hand, pointing to a body on the floor, a Red Cliff's operative, laid out cold, a bullet wound to the chest. "He came in through the back window. I managed to shoot him," she stammered, voice trembling with a mix of fear and pride. Lucas checked the man's pulse. Nothing. The man's eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. Margaret had defended herself, but the shock of taking a life had clearly rattled her. He pressed a hand to her forehead, feeling the warmth of blood. "We need to get you cleaned up." She winced. "I'm fine. Just a bump." "Help Hank. I heard his truck engine." "He must be outnumbered." Already on it, Lucas reassured her, though worry gnawed at him. He didn't like leaving her alone again. Margaret gripped his sleeve. "I'll stay here. I have the pistol." "Let them come," she said, finding a spark of her old fearlessness. Lucas nodded, impressed by her determination. He eased her against the wall in a safer spot and handed her a spare magazine. "Stay quiet. Stay down." She nodded, tears brimming but not falling. "Go," she urged. He turned to leave, glancing one last time at the lifeless mercenary. The body was a stark reminder of how high the stakes were. Even if they survived tonight, Red Cliffs would escalate. This wasn't just a land grab, it was a war. Downstairs, the firefight outside raged on. Lucas inhaled a lungful of dusty air, bracing himself. Hank's rifle shots rang out sporadically, returning the mercenaries' fire. The men from the barn might be rejoining the fray soon, or more reinforcements might arrive. A single gunshot thundered from the yard, followed by a shout of pain in Hank's voice. Lucas froze mid-step, fear twisting in his chest. Was he already too late? Lucas dashed back outside to a scene of mounting carnage. One of the SUVs burned, flames licking hungrily at the hood. Two mercenaries lay sprawled in the dirt, unmoving. The flares had fizzled out, but the firelight illuminated enough of the chaos for Lucas to see Hank doubled over near the open door of his pickup, hand clutching his side. A tall, broad-shouldered operative advanced on Hank, gun raised for a finishing shot. Without hesitation, Lucas fired. The mercenary stumbled forward, dropping his sidearm as he collapsed face first into the dirt. Gasping for breath, Hank staggered back, collapsing against his truck. Lucas sprinted to Hank's side, scanning for other threats. "You hit?" he asked, crouching. Hank's face was ashen. Blood seeped between his fingers where he pressed them to his shirt. "Caught around," he grunted. "Damn lucky shot." Lucas hauled him up, hooking Hank's arm around his own shoulders. He guided him to the shelter of the flaming SUV. Though it wouldn't protect them from the heat for long, the brightness and smoke might obscure them from the remaining attackers. "We need to get you medical attention," Lucas muttered, pressing a cloth from his vest kit against Hank's wound. Hank grimaced, struggling to speak. "Don't you worry about me," he gasped, sweat glistening on his brow. "There are still more behind the barn." Lucas glanced around. The yard had erupted into a battlefield of smoke and swirling dust. One or two mercenaries were still alive, taking cover behind outbuildings, firing sporadically. If Hank's intel was right, at least another team lurked somewhere unseen. The flicker of orange flames danced over the ranch like a twisted omen. "Stay put," Lucas ordered Hank. "Apply pressure. I'll handle the rest." Hank nodded weakly. He tried to level his rifle, but the pain in his side made it impossible. "Damn," he hissed, frustration mingling with pain. Lucas reloaded his assault rifle, scanning the perimeter for movement. The silhouettes had scattered into the gloom, but he could detect footsteps crunching through gravel near the barn. Wiping sweat and soot from his brow, he rose into a half-crouch, inching toward the building's side. The barn door was ajar, the same place where he'd taken down the two mercenaries who'd abducted Margaret. He wondered if they were still incapacitated or if reinforcements had come to retrieve them. Either way, the barn represented a potential staging area or fallback position. He heard muffled voices, a desperate radio transmission. "We're pinned at the ranch. Need extraction." Another voice replied in static-laced bursts, something about a chopper on standby. Lucas's jaw tightened. If Red Cliffs had the resources to send a helicopter, they were dealing with a serious paramilitary group, not just random hired guns. Stepping through the barn's shadowy entrance, Lucas pressed his back to the interior wall. Dust motes hung in the air, illuminated by the flicker of firelight from outside. Carefully, he inched forward, rifle aimed. The two men he'd left tied up earlier were gone, ropes cut. Bloodstains indicated they hadn't left under pleasant circumstances, but they were no longer in the barn. Then he saw them, three figures huddled around a table that served as a makeshift command post. Two were heavily armed, while a third knelt, apparently tending to one of the wounded captives. The standing men wore earpieces, rifles slung across their chests, eyes darting around warily. Lucas knew a direct assault could be suicidal, so he searched for a strategic edge. His gaze fell on an overhead pulley system that suspended heavy hay bales. The old rope and mechanical winch were used to lift feed or supplies. If he cut the rope at the right moment, he might crush or at least distract the men below. He crept toward the ladder, leading up to the loft. Each step felt like a thunderclap in his ears, but the men seemed preoccupied with their radio chatter. Once he reached the loft, he balanced on a beam, scanning the barn floor. The men had their backs turned. One typed furiously on a tablet, presumably sending coordinates. The wounded captive, the tall thug from before, sat in a chair, blood seeping through his bandaged shoulder. He glared at nothing, rage etched in every line of his face. Lucas took a steadying breath, carefully positioning himself above the massive hay bale. He needed to time this perfectly. Lowering his rifle, he drew his combat knife and sawed at the rope. Fibers strained, snapping one by one. Then, with a final slash, the rope gave way. The hay bale plummeted, smashing into the table below. Wood splintered with a deafening crash. One of the armed men was flung aside, knocked unconscious or worse. The tall thug, still in the chair, was pinned underneath the wreckage, screaming in fury. The third operative dove clear, rolling across the floor, weapon clattering away. Lucas seized the moment, dropped from the loft, and swung his rifle up. The unpinned operative scrambled to retrieve his gun. Lucas fired first, a tight burst that connected with the man's chest. He slumped to the ground, breath rattling away. The tall thug lay, trapped under the collapsed table, snarling. You don't know who you're messing with, he spat, agony twisting his features. Lucas ignored him, scanning the barn for any other threats. The only living adversary now was pinned and wounded, no longer in immediate danger. Lucas had to return to check on Hank and Margaret. But something in the tall man's voice made him pause, a note of vengeful certainty. He turned, rifle trained on the thug's bruised face. Explain? No. The man coughed, flecks of blood dotting his chin. You think it's just us? He gave a derisive, pain-laced laugh. They have a full tactical team on standby, along with local support. This entire county is bought and paid for. Lucas glanced at the shattered tablet. A single glowing line of text read, Chopper inbound, ETA 15 minutes. His mouth went dry. 15 minutes until air support arrived. Could be more armed men, or worse yet, something more lethal. He recalled rumors of corporate security forces employing heavy weaponry. Stepping forward, Lucas pressed the barrel of his rifle against the thug's chest, ignoring the man's wince. Call it off, he demanded, voice like ice. The thug scoffed. No chance. You're as good as dead. Lucas exhaled sharply, forcing himself to remain calm. He couldn't waste time trying to coerce a dying man. They needed a plan to escape or to repel a helicopter assault, and neither option seemed viable with Margaret injured, Hank shot, and the ranch partially in flames. His mind raced through possibilities. The ranch's old radio tower was half collapsed, rarely used anymore. If it still worked, maybe he could send an SOS to a distant station. But who would come? The nearest law enforcement might already be corrupted by Red Cliffs. He had no illusions about local help. He wondered if any of his old contacts could intervene. People from his Black Ops days who owed him a favor or recognized his call sign. Reaching them in time seemed a long shot. The only phone he had was the mercenaries, though. The charger was likely missing, and the battery might die soon. Suddenly, the tall thug's gaze shifted behind Lucas. Sensing movement, Lucas spun, dropping to one knee. Another mercenary, one he hadn't accounted for, emerged from the shadows, pistol raised. The muzzle flashed. A bullet ripped past Lucas's shoulder, grazing it. Pain lanced through him. He squeezed the trigger in response, hitting the operative's center mass. The attacker crashed backward, sliding across the dusty floor and falling still. Lucas pressed a hand to his arm, blood soaking through his sleeve. The wound hurt, but it wasn't disabling. Gasping, he swallowed the pain and staggered out of the barn. The glare from the burning SUV assaulted his eyes, acrid smoke stinging his nostrils. Another wave of panic rose as he scanned the yard, uncertain if more attackers lurked in the swirling haze. He found Hank slumped where he'd left him, though it looked like he'd tried to move and collapsed again. Lucas crouched beside him, checking the wound. Blood still trickled, but the makeshift bandage had staunched the worst of it. Hank's breathing was shallow, his eyes flickering open. Did we get 'em all? Hank wheezed. Lucas grimaced. For now. But more are coming from the air. Somewhere overhead, the distant thrum of helicopter blades began to rumble, faint but growing louder. Hank's eyes clouded with fear. Lucas realized that if he didn't act quickly, they'd be sitting ducks. They needed to find cover. Better yet, they needed to get out of the area altogether. But Margaret refused to abandon the ranch. Can you walk? Lucas asked Hank. Don't got much choice, Hank muttered, trying to stand. He winced, but Lucas lent him a shoulder. With Hank leaning heavily on him, they made slow progress toward the house. Each step felt heavier than the last. The whoop-whoop-whoop of the helicopter grew more ominous, cutting through the smoke-laden air. Behind them, a searchlight pierced the darkness, sweeping across the ranch yard. The chopper had arrived, and Lucas was out of time. The helicopter's spotlight danced across the ranch yard, slicing through smoke and darkness like a luminous blade. Its rotor blades thudded in an almost rhythmic cadence. Lucas felt Hank go rigid with fear beside him as they staggered toward the house's side entrance. They ducked low, trying to avoid the glaring beam. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust kicked up by gunfights. Margaret was still in the upstairs bedroom, presumably protecting herself. Lucas couldn't see any immediate movement in the living room, which was littered with broken glass and bullet casings. He guided Hank to the couch, lowering him gently. Hank's face twisted with pain, but he bit back any screams. "Let me get Ma," Lucas said, voice taut. "Then we figure out our next move." Hank nodded, pressing his hand against the bloody patch on his torso. "I'm not going anywhere," he said grimly. Lucas made his way upstairs 2 steps at a time, left arm throbbing from the grazing bullet wound. The whir of the helicopter filtered through the bullet-ridden walls, as though the entire house was caught in the rotor wash. He knocked softly on the bedroom door. Margaret's muffled voice came from inside. "Lucas." He pushed the door open. She still sat in the corner, pistol in hand, eyes darting anxiously. Relief softened her features when she saw him. "Thank God." "Hank." "He's downstairs, hurt but alive," Lucas answered, chest heaving. "We don't have much time. There's a helicopter outside. Might be more men." Margaret tried to stand, leaning on the bed for support. She staggered, cursing under her breath. "We need to hold them off," she insisted. "I won't be chased out of my own home." Lucas shook his head. "We can't fight an aerial assault with a handful of guns and no cover." His gaze swept the small room, searching for any items they could use. The ranch hadn't stored heavy ordnance in decades, certainly not anything that could challenge a helicopter. She gripped his sleeve, voice urgent. "There's an old storm cellar out near the orchard. It's half collapsed, but we can hide there, or use it as a fallback position." Lucas considered it. A storm cellar might shield them from gunfire, but it wouldn't stop the helicopter from dropping armed men or employing other tactics. However, it could buy them time. A roar overhead made the windows rattle. Peering through a bullet hole, Lucas saw a second helicopter sweeping in from the north, smaller, nimbler. "Looks like they're deploying a search team," he muttered, dread coiling in his gut. Margaret placed a trembling hand on his uninjured shoulder. "We can't let them chase us off," she repeated, voice wavering. Lucas pressed his forehead to hers for a brief, tender moment. "This is bigger than pride," he said quietly. "If we stay and fight, we might die. But if we go, Red Cliffs wins everything." She nodded, tears brimming. "I can't leave your father's legacy." He swallowed hard, torn between her resolve and the brutal reality. "We need a new plan." A burst of gunfire from outside snapped them out of the moment. "Come on," Lucas said, guiding her toward the stairs. "We'll regroup with Hank." They descended cautiously. Hank tried to rise when they entered, wincing at the movement. He was pale, sweat beading on his brow. Margaret rushed to his side, pressing a palm to his cheek. "Stay still," she scolded. "You'll bleed more." Lucas scanned the living room's battered walls, calculating angles. "If the choppers land a team here, we'll be overrun," he said flatly. "Unless..." Hank glanced up. "Unless what?" A plan formed in Lucas's mind, desperate but possibly workable. "We need to make the ranch too hot to handle. If they can't land or hover safely, they'll be forced to pull back." Margaret frowned. "How in blazes do we do that?" Lucas thought of the barn, the hay, the storage of old gasoline. "A controlled burn," he said, even as the words turned his stomach. Setting parts of the ranch on fire to create chaos would be a last resort. Yet the property was already under assault. If the orchard or outbuildings burned, it might form a smoke screen or create thermal updrafts too dangerous for the choppers to stay. But it also risked turning the entire ranch into an inferno. Margaret's jaw tensed. She looked around, eyes lingering on the family photos scattered across the floor. "Do what you must," she finally whispered, tears threatening. Lucas knelt by Hank. Margaret will take you to the cellar. I'll set some fires, create a diversion. Once the helicopters pull back or can't see, I'll join you." Hank nodded weakly, too drained to argue. Margaret slid an arm around him, supporting him with surprising strength. Lucas handed her the flashlight from his vest. "Go out the back. The orchard's down the slope. The cellar's near the old oak." She nodded, her eyes reflecting steely determination amid heartbreak. They moved toward the rear exit. Lucas forced himself to look away, focusing on the mission at hand. It felt like he was stepping off a cliff, trusting there was a safety net somewhere below. But there was no safety net here, only grit and desperation. He hurried to the kitchen, rummaging through drawers until he found an old lighter. Then he grabbed a jug of kerosene from under the sink, intended for lamps during power outages. A single jug wouldn't be enough, but it was a start. He spotted the basement door, remembering the diesel barrels stored there for the generator. That could amplify the conflagration. Outside, the spotlight swept across the house again, beams shining through the windows. Lucas heard distant shouts, the thrum of rotor blades intensifying. Determined, he descended into the basement, ignoring the damp smell of mold and earth. He found 2 half-full barrels of diesel, each with a siphon pump. Grunting, he struggled to roll them up the narrow steps. The helicopter's engines revved overhead, sending vibrations through the walls. Another flurry of bullets struck the roof, wood beams cracking. Lucas hissed curses under his breath. The enemy was likely trying to suppress any movement inside. Finally, he managed to haul the first barrel to the front porch. Using the siphon, he splashed diesel across the porch steps, the yard's dry patches, and the base of the broken fence. The stench was overwhelming, eyes watering. He set the barrel down, then sprinted back for the second, repeating the process around the barn. At one point, a stray bullet pinged off the diesel barrel, sparking a jolt of terror. If that bullet had ignited the fumes, he might have gone up in flames right then. But luck held. Once the barn's outer wall was soaked, Lucas grabbed his lighter and flicked it on. For a moment, he hesitated, the small flame dancing in the breeze. This was his childhood home. Memories of riding horses in the field, learning to shoot cans on fence posts, celebrating birthdays in the barn. Now he was turning it into a war zone. He gritted his teeth and tossed the lighter. The diesel ignited in a violent whoosh, flames leaping skyward with terrifying swiftness. Embers drifted into the night, swirling in the rotor wash of the nearest helicopter. The heat was immediate and intense, driving Lucas back several steps. Within seconds, the blaze began to spread, devouring the wooden structure with crackling ferocity. Smoke billowed upward, forming a thick column that threatened to obscure the yard. Lucas heard the helicopter's engines sputter in alarm. The swirling smoke and rising heat made low altitude hovering dangerous. One chopper veered off to the side, trying to find a clearer vantage. The other circled wider, searchlight bobbing as it attempted to track Lucas's movements. Grabbing the remaining jug of kerosene from the porch, he splashed it along the nearby scrub brush and set it alight. The resulting inferno merged with the barn fire, creating a large perimeter of heat and smoke. Even if the men on the ground wanted to approach, they'd have to battle through a wall of flame and choking fumes. Sprinting around the side of the house, Lucas saw the orchard in the distance. Smoke drifted that way, but hopefully Margaret and Hank were safe beneath the earth in the storm cellar. He needed to get there before the flames grew uncontrolled, or before the mercenaries realized the orchard was unburned territory. A volley of gunfire raked the ground near him. The second chopper had repositioned, side door open. A sniper or machine gun operator sprayed bullets from above, muzzle flashing like an angry star. Lucas dove behind a trough, pressing his chest to the dirt. Dust and debris rained down, the gunfire deafening. A bullet ricocheted off the trough, grazing Lucas's scalp. Blood trickled down his forehead as the orchard seemed impossibly far away, and the chopper circled back for another pass. Pain pounded through Lucas's head, warm blood trickling down his temple. The bullet's graze left him dizzy, but he forced himself to stay conscious. As the helicopter strafed the yard, Lucas crawled into the shadow of a smoldering fence post, hearing the hiss of flames behind him. The heat pressed him like a living entity, and the acrid smoke made his eyes burn. He inched forward, flattening himself against the parched ground. The helicopter's spotlight swept the area, searching for him. Lucas heard the chatter of a gunner relaying coordinates. Time felt elastic, each second stretched by tension and adrenaline. Gradually, the helicopter turned away, apparently focusing on the raging barn fire. Lucas seized the moment. He rose into a half-crouch, running toward the orchard's edge. The orchard itself, once lush with fruit trees, was now a tangle of gnarled branches and overgrown weeds. Some trees were dead or dying from the recent drought, while others stood like silent sentinels in the moonlight. He found a narrow path leading between the rows of trees. Every step threatened to betray him with a snap of a twig. Smoke rolled overhead in thick billows, tinted orange by the flames engulfing the barn. A cough rattled in his throat, but he tried to keep silent. At last, he spotted the old oak, its wide trunk silhouetted against the flicker of distant fire. The storm cellar hatch stood at its base, partially obscured by creeping vines. He hurried forward, ignoring the throb in his head and the searing ache in his arm. "Ma." "Hank," he hissed, fumbling for the latch. The wooden doors shuddered, then cracked open from inside. Margaret's face appeared, illuminated by a flickering flashlight. Relief flooded her features when she saw Lucas, though she gasped at the sight of blood on his forehead. "Lord Almighty, Lucas." "Not now," he cut her off gently, hauling the doors open the rest of the way. The cellar was a cramped, dank space, more of a root cellar turned storm shelter. Hank lay on a makeshift cot, breathing labored but stable, while Margaret hovered with a first aid kit. Lucas descended the short ladder. The cellar smelled of earth and mildew, but it was cool compared to the inferno outside. The barn's on fire, forcing the choppers to keep their distance for now. But that won't hold them off forever. They might try a ground approach soon, or they'll wait until the flames die down. Margaret pressed gauze to his head. "You're hurt," she said, worry etched in her tone. He winced at the sting of antiseptic. "Just a graze." "Hank." Hank's eyes flicked open, bloodshot and weary. "I'll live," he rasped. "Bullets lodged somewhere in my side. Need a real doc eventually." Lucas nodded grimly. "We have to get you out of here. Both of you. There's no telling what Red Cliffs will do next. They might bring in heavier gear or send in ground troops. And there's still that second helicopter circling." Margaret's face hardened. "I told you I'm not leaving the ranch." "We don't have a choice," Lucas replied, voice firm. "If they bomb the place, or if the fire spreads, we'll be trapped. We need to survive first, then we'll regroup, find a way to take them down legally or otherwise." She turned away, tears in her eyes. "I've watched too many people walk off this land, never to return." Lucas gently took her hand. "Ma, we either leave tonight or we risk dying in this hole. I promise, I'll do everything in my power to reclaim the ranch. But we can't do it if we're dead." Her shoulders sagged. She sniffled, then gave a trembling nod. "All right," she relented. "But how do we escape with those helicopters overhead?" Lucas exhaled, scanning the small space. A battered set of shelves held jars of preserved fruits and vegetables. Rusty tools leaned in a corner. A memory stirred. Behind the cellar was an abandoned irrigation ditch that led past the orchard. If they could reach it undetected, maybe they could slip away under cover of darkness. "We'll use the ditch," he said, kneeling beside Hank. "If we can get him upright, we'll move slowly and keep our heads down. The orchard's canopy might shield us from the chopper's spotlight." Hank mustered a half grin. "Sounds like a plan. Let's just hope these old bones can take it." Lucas helped Margaret fashion a makeshift stretcher using a piece of tarp and some wooden slats. It wasn't perfect, but it would allow them to drag Hank rather than forcing him to walk on his wounded side. Every second spent in preparation felt like an hour, the roar of the helicopter occasionally overhead. They heard another explosion from the yard, likely something else catching fire. The ground trembled slightly, sending dirt clods tumbling from the cellar ceiling. At last, they were ready. Lucas cracked open the cellar doors and peered out. The orchard was partially lit by a glow from the distant flames, but thick columns of smoke drifted between the trees. The helicopter's searchlight occasionally cut across the orchard's edge, but it seemed more focused on the raging fire near the house. Lucas waved Margaret forward. She climbed out, holding one end of the makeshift stretcher while Lucas lifted the other. Hank lay in the middle, eyes squeezed shut against pain. They emerged into the orchard, quickly lowering themselves behind the trunk of the massive oak. A flash of light swept overhead, prompting them to freeze. Seconds later, the searchlight moved on. In the distance, Lucas heard faint shouting, maybe orders for ground teams to approach from the west side of the ranch. They had no time to spare. "We move fast and quiet," Lucas whispered. "Follow me." Step by step, they navigated the orchard's uneven ground. Margaret struggled with the weight of the stretcher, but her determination fueled her. Hank bit his lip, stifling grunts of pain. Lucas paused intermittently, scanning the sky for the helicopter's beam. Twice they had to duck behind twisted apple trees, waiting for the searchlight to pass. Finally, they reached the far end of the orchard, where a shallow ditch marked the remnants of a long-defunct irrigation system. The ground sloped downward, disappearing into a dark tunnel of overgrowth. Lucas tested the footing. Damp earth, partly covered by a collapsed wooden framework. But it might serve as a passable route. He handed the stretcher's front end to Margaret. "Lower him in slowly," he instructed, then climbed into the ditch first. A putrid stench of stagnant water and rotting leaves assaulted his nose. Still, it was cover. They eased Hank down, careful not to jostle his wound too much. Once inside the ditch, the tall grass and bushes formed a natural canopy above them. They crawled, dragging the stretcher, breath ragged. In the distance, the roar of flames continued, along with sporadic gunfire. After what felt like an eternity, the ditch opened up into a shallow depression. The orchard fell behind them, and the ranch's perimeter fence rose in the near distance. If they could slip under or through it, they'd be outside Red Cliff's immediate kill zone. But just as they cleared the orchard's boundary, a bright light filled their vision, accompanied by the thunderous flutter of the helicopter overhead. The searchlight pinned them like prey, revealing their exact location. "Move," Lucas shouted, adrenaline surging. He lifted the stretcher's front end and practically sprinted the remaining yards, Margaret scrabbling behind. Bullets churned up the dirt around them, stinging their legs with flying debris. They reached the fence, a sagging barbed wire barrier. Lucas frantically shoved a rotting post aside, creating a gap. Margaret squeezed through, dragging Hank. The barbed wire snagged her shirt, tearing fabric, but she kept going. Once on the other side, Lucas dove after them, ignoring the lances of pain in his shoulder and scalp. The helicopter circled back, but they had enough of a head start. The open field beyond the ranch was dotted with mesquite and tall grasses. If they got enough distance, the chopper might lose them in the darkness. With ragged breaths, they pressed on, weaving between shrubs and gullies. The ground sloped downward, leading toward a dry creek bed that once fed the ranch's irrigation channels. Hank groaned, eyes fluttering. Lucas feared he might lose consciousness soon. At last, they collapsed behind an outcropping of rocks near the creek bed. The helicopter's searchlight swept overhead, missing them by mere yards, then passed on. For the moment, they were hidden. Hank's labored breathing faltered, and his eyes rolled back. Margaret screamed in alarm as Lucas frantically checked for a pulse, uncertain if their friend was about to die in the darkness they had fought so hard to reach. Hank's face was ashen, his pulse thready against Lucas's fingertips. Panicked, Margaret pressed a shaking hand to Hank's forehead, feeling the cold sweat there. Lucas pulled out the small medical kit from his vest, rummaging for anything that might stabilize Hank. A clotting agent, painkillers, sterile gauze. "We're losing him," Margaret whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. Lucas forced calm into his voice. "He's lost a lot of blood, but he's still with us. Keep pressure on the wound." He handed Margaret a thick pad of gauze, then carefully adjusted Hank's shirt to expose the site. Blood seeped out, but not in a torrent. It was more of a slow, steady oozing. That was both a curse and a blessing. Though less immediate hemorrhage, it indicated a deeper wound. He applied the clotting powder, pressing it firmly, ignoring Hank's involuntary groan. The orchard and the ranch behind them were now a distant glow of firelight, the chopper's rumble receding as if searching elsewhere. Perhaps Red Cliffs believed the trio couldn't have escaped. For now, that was their best hope for survival. Margaret stroked Hank's hair, eyes wet with gratitude and fear. "Don't you leave me, you stubborn old fool," she murmured, voice catching in her throat. Lucas let her speak to Hank, focusing on scanning their surroundings. Dawn was still hours away, the horizon only faintly lightening. If they stayed put, they'd risk being spotted when daylight came. They needed to get Hank to some kind of medical help. But where? The local clinic might be compromised by Red Cliff's reach. The next nearest hospital was miles away, and their vehicle was back at the ranch, likely riddled with bullet holes. A memory flickered. There was a traveling nurse, rumored to have set up shop in a mobile home near the county line. She'd patch up folks too proud or too poor to go to the hospital. Maybe that was their best shot, but it would require traveling on foot or finding another vehicle. Margaret's voice cut through his thoughts, trembling with urgency. "Lucas, what do we do?" He squeezed the tension from his brow. "I know someone who might help," he said, nodding toward the east. "We could try to reach them by foot or hijack a ride. Either way, we can't stay here till morning." She swallowed hard, tucking Hank's limp arm across his chest. "Then let's go," she whispered, though her eyes held reluctance. Each step away from the ranch felt like a betrayal of her family legacy. They fashioned another stretcher from the tarp, securing Hank more tightly so they could move faster without jostling him too much. The land sloped downward, eventually merging with a gravel road that cut through the low hills. If they could make it there, perhaps they'd find a passing vehicle, though at this hour the road would be mostly deserted. Step by grueling step, they trudged on. The night air grew cooler, a stark contrast to the inferno they'd fled. Margaret stumbled occasionally, her exhaustion evident, but she refused to relinquish her share of the stretcher. Lucas marveled at her resilience. She was older, injured, and carrying a heavy emotional burden, yet she pressed forward with a fierce determination that left him humbled. Hours seemed to pass, the darkness slowly transforming into a pale gray sky. Hank's breathing remained shallow, but the clotting agent seemed to be working. He occasionally stirred, mumbling incoherent words. Lucas offered water from a canteen, careful not to choke him. At last, the faint outline of the gravel road appeared in the dim morning light. A battered sign read, "County Line 3 miles." Lucas scanned the horizon, pressing a hand to his throbbing scalp wound. No sign of the helicopter. Perhaps Red Cliffs had withdrawn to regroup, or maybe they believed the trio dead in the blaze. If luck was on their side, they'd keep their distance for a little while. Margaret nearly buckled beneath the stretcher's weight. Lucas urged her to rest, but she shook her head stubbornly. "We're almost there," she panted. "Just a bit more." They followed the gravel road, each crunch of stone beneath their boots a reminder of how exposed they were. If a Red Cliffs patrol came cruising by, they'd have nowhere to hide. But none appeared. Instead, the first rays of dawn began to color the sky with a cautious gold, illuminating the deserted stretch. Finally, a dust trail in the distance signaled the approach of a vehicle, a faded blue pickup chugging along at a slow pace. Lucas set down the stretcher, raising his hands to flag it down, hoping it wasn't another band of mercenaries. As the pickup rumbled closer, the driver, a wiry old man in a cowboy hat, slowed, eyes wide with shock. Margaret called out, "Please. We have an injured man." The truck screeched to a halt. The driver hopped out, scanning the scene with alarm. "What in tarnation, Margaret Barrett?" he exclaimed, recognizing her. "What happened?" Margaret's eyes brimmed with tears. "We were attacked. Need to get Hank to a doctor." The old man didn't hesitate, motioning them to load Hank into the truck bed. "Name's Jeb," he said. "Used to fix fences at your place, ma'am. I'll take you anywhere you need to go." Lucas nodded gratefully. "Thank you," he said, voice cracked from fatigue. "We know a nurse who can help. Head for the county line, then another 5 miles east." They hoisted Hank into the truck bed, Margaret climbing in to cradle him. Lucas slid into the passenger seat, his rifle resting across his knees. Jeb eyed the weapon nervously, but said nothing, turning the key in the ignition. The truck rumbled back onto the gravel road, picking up speed. As they drove, the morning sky fully revealed itself, painting the rugged landscape with soft hues of orange and pink. It felt surreal, so much had changed in just one night. The ranch, their safe haven for generations, was now smoldering ruins under corporate siege. Lucas's head throbbed, and he could only imagine the emotional torment Margaret endured. "Goddamn developers," Jeb muttered under his breath. Knew they were trouble the minute they showed up in town, waving their money around. Lucas glanced at him, heart heavy. "They have half the county in their pocket," he said. "We need to figure out a way to fight back." Margaret, cradling Hank, forced a nod. "We will," she whispered. "Once we're safe." They rode in silence for another half hour. The rugged landscape gave way to sparser vegetation, the air thick with dust. Lucas kept vigilant watch, half expecting a convoy of black SUVs or a helicopter to appear at any moment. But no threat emerged, at least not yet. Eventually, they neared a solitary trailer parked off a side road, its siding battered by the elements. A small hand-painted sign read Nurse Rita's clinic. It looked deserted, but a thin plume of smoke curled from the chimney. Jeb pulled up, and Lucas hopped out, scanning the area for danger. Satisfied, he helped lift Hank from the truck bed, Margaret supporting the other side. They approached the trailer door. Lucas knocked, hearing faint movement within. A middle-aged woman with gray-streaked hair cracked the door open, alarm flickering in her eyes at the sight of blood and weapons. "We need help," Lucas said simply. "He's been shot." She swallowed hard. "Bring him in," she replied, stepping aside to let them pass into the cramped interior. The space smelled of antiseptic and cooking spices, an odd but strangely comforting mix. A makeshift exam table occupied one corner, medical supplies neatly stacked on open shelves. They laid Hank on the table, Nurse Rita immediately cutting away his shirt to examine the wound. She frowned at the improvised bandages and clotted blood, but her touch was professional. "He's in rough shape," she said, injecting a syringe of painkiller. "Bullet might still be lodged in there. I'll do what I can, but I'm not a surgeon." Margaret clutched Hank's hand. "Do what you must." The nurse motioned for everyone to step back, rummaging for forceps and surgical implements. Lucas pulled Margaret aside, letting Nurse Rita work in relative peace. Exhaustion weighed heavily on them both. Jeb lingered by the door, hat in hand. "I'll stay outside, keep watch. If any trouble heads this way, I'll holler." Lucas thanked him. Then, turning to Margaret, he saw the question in her eyes. What now? They had escaped immediate danger, but the real battle was far from over. Red Cliffs had proven its willingness to employ lethal force, and the ranch was likely still surrounded or burned. A sudden buzz from the mercenaries' phone in Lucas's pocket vibrated against his thigh. He pulled it out and saw a single text message. "We know where you are." Lucas stared at the ominous text. "We know where you are." His blood ran cold. How had Red Cliffs tracked them? A hidden GPS on one of their phones? A traitorous radio signal from the battered SUV? The possibilities churned through his mind. Margaret saw his expression and asked, "What is it?" He showed her the screen, and her face paled. Nurse Rita glanced at them while working on Hank, forceps clinking against a metal tray. "Whatever that is, keep it away from my trailer," she snapped, not bothering to hide her fear. "I patch folks up, but I'm not about to die for a cause I don't understand." Lucas nodded grimly. "We won't bring trouble to your doorstep," he assured her. "But we might already have." Margaret cradled her aching wrist, eyes flicking between Hank's unconscious form and Lucas. "If they're tracking us, they could be on their way here now," she said quietly. Jeb stuck his head in, hat brimming with sweat. "Road's quiet, but that can change any minute." They had to move. But where? Hank needed immediate care. Nurse Rita worked diligently, but it was clear she didn't have the capability for extended treatment or surgery if the bullet caused internal damage. If they tried to drive Hank to a major hospital, they risked running into Red Cliffs or alerting local authorities in Red Cliff's pockets. Lucas ground his teeth. He felt trapped, responsible for the safety of everyone here. "We can't lead them to you," he said to Rita, turning off the phone. "We'll have to move Hank once he's stable. Find a place off the grid." Rita clucked her tongue, her hands steady as she continued her makeshift surgery. "I'll do what I can. He'll be weak for weeks, bullet or no bullet. I can't promise he'll survive being moved around like a duffel bag." Margaret wiped tears from her cheeks. "He saved my life," she whispered. "I won't abandon him." Lucas's mind raced. "We might not have to move him far. There's an old ghost town about 2 miles from here, Gold Creek. No one's lived there in decades, except drifters occasionally. If we hide him there, can you travel back and forth to treat him?" Rita hesitated, scanning Margaret's earnest face. "Gold Creek, huh? I know it. The old mining ruins. I'll do what I can, but I'm not guaranteeing success." Jeb cleared his throat. "I'll help. Don't want to see these land-grabbing snakes take over. Hell, I owe Hank a few favors." Lucas nodded, gratitude mixing with urgency. "Let's load Hank back up when you're done. We'll do it quietly. If Red Cliffs finds an abandoned ghost town, maybe they'll assume no one's there. We can keep watch." Margaret's shoulders shook with the weight of her conflicting emotions. Their ranch was under siege, Hank was gravely wounded, and now they were going to hide in a ghost town like fugitives. Yet her eyes glimmered with a steely resolve. "We protect our own," she said simply. Time crawled in tense silence as Rita worked on Hank. She eventually extracted a battered bullet fragment, the forceps clanking into a metal bowl. She packed the wound with gauze, stitching him up as best she could. Lucas marveled at her steadiness in such dire circumstances. Finally, she straightened, wiping sweat from her brow. "He's stable enough to move, but don't let him bounce around too much. He needs antibiotics, rest, and no more stress." Lucas and Jeb carefully lifted Hank, placing him in the truck bed again, adding blankets for padding. Margaret hovered, tears welling in her eyes as she kissed Hank's forehead. "Hold on, old friend," she whispered. Rita handed Lucas a small bag of medical supplies. "Change his dressings twice a day. If fever sets in, he'll need stronger meds. I'll try to stop by if I can do it safely, but no promises." Lucas offered a firm handshake. "We appreciate your help. If anyone asks, you haven't seen us." Rita's eyes flicked nervously to the phone in Lucas's pocket. "You'd better get rid of that tracking device." He nodded, stepping outside with the phone. The morning sun was well above the horizon now, revealing a dusty landscape of scrub and rock. He smashed the phone under his boot, then pried out the SIM card and destroyed it as well. One less way for them to be traced, he hoped. Climbing into the passenger seat, he turned to check on Margaret in the back with Hank. She offered a weary nod, her expression a mixture of hope and dread. Jeb started the truck, the engine rattling to life. They pulled away from Rita's trailer, leaving behind the only semblance of medical refuge for miles. "We'll take the back roads," Jeb murmured, eyes scanning the empty horizon. "It's a rougher ride, but safer from prying eyes." The dusty back roads took them through rocky outcrops and winding trails. Each bump made Hank grunt in pain, though he remained mercifully unconscious most of the time. Every now and then, Lucas glanced skyward, half expecting the roar of helicopter blades. But the sky remained eerily silent. Maybe Red Cliffs was regrouping or searching elsewhere. They eventually arrived at a faded wooden sign, Gold Creek, 1 mile. Beyond that sign, scattered dilapidated buildings emerged from the scrub, remnants of a mining era that had long since passed. Sagging porches, broken windows, and rusted metal scraps dotted the dusty street. Jeb maneuvered the truck around the debris, finding a relatively intact structure, a former inn, by the looks of the flaking sign overhead. "Let's set up in there," Lucas suggested, pointing. "Plenty of rooms, maybe some old furniture to make Hank comfortable." They parked behind the building, out of sight from the main road. The boards creaked ominously under their footsteps as they carried Hank inside. Dust motes swirled in the stale air. A musty smell clung to everything, the memory of dampness and abandonment. They found a back room on the first floor, still containing an old bed frame with a sunken mattress. Lucas and Jeb gently placed Hank onto it, piling blankets beneath him to cushion the sagging springs. Margaret hovered close, brushing hair from Hank's forehead. While she fussed over Hank, Lucas and Jeb explored the rest of the building, checking for signs of squatters or hazards. Broken glass and rotted floorboards were the main dangers. No immediate sign of other people. "Think we can hold out here for a bit," Jeb mused, peering out a shattered window at the empty street. Lucas pressed his aching shoulder. "We'll take shifts watching the road. If Red Cliffs finds out we're here, we won't have much warning." Jeb nodded, jaw set. "Let's do it." That night, they rigged makeshift fortifications, barricading the doors with broken furniture and covering the windows as best they could. The desert wind moaned through the gaps, a ghostly chorus in the abandoned town. Margaret sat by Hank, checking his bandages and wiping the sweat from his brow. Lucas took up position by a window, assault rifle in hand, scanning the star-filled sky. For hours, they waited, adrenaline pulsing. Every crunch of shifting wood, every gust of wind, felt like an approaching threat. But no one came. By dawn, Lucas's eyes drooped with exhaustion, and he finally allowed himself a few minutes of rest while Jeb took over the watch. Margaret dozed fitfully in a chair near Hank's bed, her posture stiff. Despite everything, she refused to lie down. Each time Lucas glanced at her, he saw the flicker of guilt and worry in her eyes. The ranch was on her mind always, a sacred place torn away by violence. 2 days passed in a tense blur. Nurse Rita arrived once at dusk, bringing fresh supplies and checking Hank's progress. She told them rumors swirled about a massive fire at the Barrett Ranch, with multiple casualties. The county officials blamed a freak accident, but rumor had it Red Cliffs was quietly taking over the property, blocking off public access. Margaret's face hardened at the news. "They can't just steal my home," she hissed, fists clenching. "We have to fight back." Lucas understood her anger, but he also recognized the risk. "They have connections and men with guns," he reminded her gently. "We need proof of corruption, or enough firepower to make it too costly for them to continue." She squared her shoulders, determination lighting her eyes. "I have old land deeds, records of bribes, suspicious deals. Henry, my late husband, kept files on everything those swindlers tried. They're at the ranch, hidden in the attic." A plan began to form in Lucas's mind. If they retrieved those documents, they might build a legal case or at least blackmail Red Cliffs into backing off. But it meant going back to the ranch, behind enemy lines. Margaret locked eyes with Lucas. "We have to get those files," she said, voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "Whatever it takes." And Lucas knew there was no turning back. 3 nights later, under the cover of darkness, Lucas and Margaret set out for the ranch. Hank remained in the ghost town under Jeb's watchful care. Though still weak, he was stable enough that they felt confident leaving him behind. Nurse Rita promised to check in as often as possible, though she insisted on utmost secrecy. Margaret insisted on going. "I know where Henry hid the papers," she stated firmly, "and I'm not letting you roam my house without me." Her knees still bothered her, but the pain did little to quell her determination. They took Jeb's truck, leaving him with an old motorcycle as a backup vehicle in case of emergency. The plan was simple yet perilous. Reach the ranch after midnight, scout for Red Cliff security, slip into the attic, and retrieve the files. If caught, they'd have no choice but to fight or flee. The night road was desolate. Moonlight bathed the desert in a pale glow, revealing black silhouettes of cacti and distant hills. Margaret clutched her cane, face set like granite, peering out the window at the land she loved. She hadn't seen it since that fateful night, and dread mingled with longing in her eyes. They approached the ranch from the south, using an unpaved side trail. The smell of chard would reach them before they even saw the remains of the barn. Lucas pulled the truck to a stop behind a thicket of brush. They climbed out, dousing the headlights. Only the faint hush of the wind accompanied them. From a small ridge, they looked down at the property. The barn was reduced to a skeleton of blackened beams, the farmhouse's roof partially collapsed. A single floodlight stood on a makeshift metal pole, illuminating the front yard. Two black SUVs were parked near the scorched remains of the barn, suggesting a security presence. A portable generator hummed faintly, likely powering that floodlight and any other gear. Margaret swallowed hard at the sight of her beloved home in ruins. Lucas laid a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Focus on a mission," he murmured. She gave a tight nod, brushing away a tear. They circled wide, skirting the property line. A perimeter fence now enclosed most of the front yard, topped with barbed wire in places. Lucas guessed it was installed by Red Cliffs to discourage trespassers. He motioned for Margaret to stay low as they crept through the darkness. At one point, they spotted two armed guards patrolling the yard, flashlights cutting through the gloom. They wore tactical gear, insignias removed, exuding professional menace. It reinforced Lucas's suspicion that Red Cliffs had hired a private military contractor, not just common thugs. Margaret's breath hitched. She'd never imagined her own land would be patrolled by hostile gunmen. Lucas reached into his pack, pulling out a set of wire cutters. "We'll cut through the fence on the north side, by the orchard," he whispered. She nodded, stifling her fury. They moved slowly, mindful of every twig and stone underfoot. The orchard was a blackened swath of trees, many scorched from the barn fires spread. A pungent smell of charred bark and ash lingered. Margaret had to pause, steadying herself against a scorched trunk, tears threatening to break through her stoic demeanor. Lucas forced himself to stay focused. He found a spot where the fence angled away from the floodlight's beam. One snip, then another, and he created an opening just wide enough for them to slip through. He helped Margaret navigate the jagged wire, mindful of her cane and her wounded pride. Once inside the perimeter, they took cover behind what remained of a tool shed. Its roof collapsed. From there, they had a better view of the farmhouse. Portions of the walls were still intact, but half the roof had caved in, exposing the attic to the sky. If the documents Margaret spoke of were still inside, retrieving them might be dangerous if the structure was unsound. Margaret braced herself. "The attic's at the north end, near the chimney. We can get to it through my bedroom closet." Henry built a hidden hatch. Lucas nodded. They waited for the guards to pass again, tracking the bobbing beams of flashlights. Then they sprinted across the open yard, hearts hammering. Ash swirled underfoot, and the porch groaned ominously when they stepped onto it. Inside, the house was a maze of scorched furniture, plaster debris, and broken beams. The floodlight cast harsh shadows through the missing walls. The air felt stale and lifeless, like a tomb. Lucas had to hold back a cough as dust and ash clogged his throat. Margaret led the way to the remains of her bedroom. The door was ripped from its hinges, the ceiling partially collapsed near the far corner. She moved carefully, leaning on her cane, scanning the wreckage. "Over here," she said, pointing to a wall that was still standing. Lucas spotted a narrow closet door, half off its hinges. He stepped inside, rummaging past tattered clothes and water-damaged boxes. Sure enough, there was a small hatch in the ceiling, now slightly ajar due to the damage. He tested the ladder attached to the hatch. It creaked but held. "I'll go first," he murmured. Margaret watched anxiously, shining a small flashlight upward. Lucas hoisted himself into the attic, carefully distributing his weight to avoid weakened sections of the floor. The space smelled of smoke and old cedar. Sparks of moonlight filtered through a gaping hole in the roof. Broken beams, charred insulation, and scattered trinkets lay everywhere. He scanned for any sign of the documents. Margaret had mentioned Henry kept them in a locked chest. Gritting his teeth, Lucas navigated the debris. At one point, the floor shifted under his foot, dropping an inch with a soft crunch that set his nerves on edge. Then he saw it, a metal trunk half buried under splintered rafters. It appeared scorched along one side, but intact. He crouched, gently moving debris aside. The trunk was locked with a rusty padlock, but one good strike with the butt of his rifle snapped it. The lid creaked open, revealing a trove of yellowed papers, file folders, and a small leather-bound ledger. Lucas's heart pounded. This could be the evidence they needed: land deeds, corruption records, maybe names and amounts paid in bribes. Margaret was right. Henry had meticulously documented everything. Gingerly, Lucas gathered the folders and ledger into a canvas bag he'd brought for the purpose. Suddenly, a crunch below alerted him. Margaret hissed his name. He crept back to the hatch, peering down. She gestured urgently, eyes wide with alarm. From somewhere within the ruins, voices echoed. The guards were inside the house. Lucas froze, every sense on high alert. If the guards found them in the attic, they'd be cornered. He had to lead them away, or else risk a direct shootout in a precarious structure. He handed the canvas bag down to Margaret, who clutched it tight. Then he motioned for her to climb the ladder, but she shook her head, pointing to her knee. She wouldn't be able to ascend or descend quickly. The voices drew closer, scanning the rubble. One guard said, "Over here, footprints." Another responded in a clipped tone, "They might be intruders. Check the bedroom." Lucas glanced around the attic, searching for an alternative exit. A gaping hole in the roof, near the chimney, offered a possible path to the outside. It would be risky, but better than a direct confrontation inside. He signaled to Margaret, "Go." She hesitated only a second. He grabbed her hand, helping her onto the ladder as quietly as possible. She managed a few rungs, wincing with each movement. The floor below creaked, a distinct footstep on broken boards. "Someone's here," a guard shouted. They had seconds. Lucas hoisted Margaret with surprising strength, pushing her through the hole in the roof. She gasped at the cold night air. He scrambled after, rifle slung over his shoulder, the canvas bag tight against his chest. Outside, they found themselves on a half-collapsed section of the roof. One portion sloped downward into the yard, while a broken gutter dangled precariously. The guards' flashlights probed the bedroom below, illuminating the hatch. Lucas helped Margaret inch along the roofline, praying it wouldn't give way. She clutched the canvas bag, face drawn with fear and adrenaline. The desert wind whipped around them, carrying ash and dust. "Up there," a guard shouted, shining a flashlight through the hole in the roof. "Their cover blown." Lucas guided Margaret to the gutter. "We have to jump," he hissed, though it was less than a story to the ground. She nodded, eyes brimming with resolve. He grabbed her around the waist, lowering her as far as he could, then let go. She landed hard, stumbling, but stayed upright, clutching the bag. Lucas followed, dropping beside her. The impact jarred his sore arm, but he pushed through the pain. Gunfire erupted from above, bullets splintering the roof. Lucas seized Margaret's hand, pulling her into a crouch. They scurried behind the farmhouse, hearts pounding. Another round of shots whistled by, sending debris flying. With no time to waste, They ducked around the corner of the house and sprinted toward the orchard. An alarm blared near the barn, a piercing siren that shattered the night stillness. Clearly, Red Cliffs had a security system installed. There they are, someone yelled, flashlight beams zeroing in on them. Lucas fired a few covering shots, forcing the guards to take cover behind rubble. He and Margaret ran for the fence line, the orchard's skeletal trees providing minimal cover. The alarm wailed incessantly, and more voices joined the chase. They reached the fence where they cut the wire. Margaret slipped through, passing the bag to Lucas. He glanced back, saw two guards bounding across the orchard, rifles flashing. Bullets sang past. Lucas unleashed another burst of return fire, forcing them to dive behind a truck. Finally, both he and Margaret were through the fence. Keeping low, they dashed toward the truck's hiding spot. The night was alive with barking orders and the screech of tires as the SUV engines roared. Red Cliff's men would be swarming the area within moments. They reached the truck, panting, bodies shaking with adrenaline. Lucas threw open the passenger door, helping Margaret inside. He scrambled behind the wheel. The engine coughed once, then roared to life. Headlights off, he floored the gas pedal, the truck fishtailing in the dirt. A black SUV crested the ridge ahead, headlights blazing, blocking their escape route, as Lucas swerved to avoid a head-on collision. Lucas cranked the steering wheel, the truck slewing sideways in a desperate attempt to avoid the SUV. Gravel sprayed in all directions. The black vehicle's engine roared, its headlights illuminating the swirling dust. For an instant, it seemed collision was inevitable. At the last moment, Lucas veered onto a narrow cattle trail, the truck's suspension groaning under the sudden turn. The SUV shot past, skidding to a stop in a cloud of grit. Lucas glimpsed armed figures piling out, their shouts drowned out by the truck's revving engine. Margaret clutched the canvas bag of documents to her chest. Her knuckles went white, her face pale beneath the moonlight. "They're not giving up," she muttered, voice trembling with adrenaline. "No, they're not," Lucas agreed grimly, glancing in the rearview mirror. The SUV spun around, headlights bearing down on them. Another set of lights appeared on the horizon, joining the chase. He pushed the truck faster, bouncing over potholes and washes that threatened to snap the axles. Dust choked the air inside the cab. Margaret gasped, trying to keep her seatbelt secure, the bag of documents never leaving her grip. "You okay?" Lucas barked, sparing her a quick glance. She nodded tightly. "We can't let them take these," she said, referring to the files. "They prove everything: bribes, land grabs, illegal permits. It's all there." Lucas grunted, urging the truck up a steep incline. Jeb's old pickup roared in protest, but it powered onward. Behind them, the SUVs struggled on the uneven terrain, but their superior engines quickly made up for any lost ground. The chase became a twisted ballet of dodging rocks, weaving around mesquite shrubs, and clinging to the slightest advantage. Suddenly, the faint chop of rotor blades cut through the din. Lucas's heart sank. A helicopter approached, its searchlights slicing across the scrubland. "They found us," he hissed. Margaret's eyes darted upward. The brilliant beams swept the desert, zeroing in on the truck's dusty trail. In seconds, they were bathed in harsh white light, making it nearly impossible to see the uneven ground ahead. "Hold on," Lucas shouted. He yanked the wheel again, heading toward a ravine he recalled from old ranching routes. It was risky, one wrong turn could roll the truck, but if they made it into the ravine, the helicopter's angle might be compromised. The descent was brutal. The truck lurched, nearly tipping on two wheels before slamming back down. The helicopter's light overshot them for a moment, and the roar of the rotor blades echoed across the rocky walls. Lucas clenched his jaw, sweat stinging his eyes. Behind them, the SUVs paused at the ravine's edge, momentarily unsure of the terrain. But the helicopter continued to track them, hovering overhead. The wash at the base of the ravine was dry, strewn with boulders. Lucas navigated carefully, the truck's undercarriage scraping. Margaret held her breath, her cane rattling against the seat. Up ahead, the ravine curved sharply. If they took it too fast, they'd crash. If they slowed, the helicopter and SUVs would converge on them. The stakes were clear. They had to find a path out before red cliffs pinned them. Just then, the helicopter's side door slid open. Muzzle flashes erupted from above, a hail of gunfire spattering across the ravine. Rocks splintered, dust filling the air. Lucas ducked, but one bullet shattered the windshield, glass raining over them. Margaret screamed, arms shielding her face, the bag pressed close. Lucas gritted his teeth, forcing the truck onward. "Stay low," he yelled, body tense with fear. Another burst of gunfire tore a hole in the hood, steam hissing as the engine took damage. The truck's acceleration faltered, and Lucas felt the steering go sluggish. "We're hit," Margaret cried, panic rising. Lucas pumped the brakes, wrestling the wheel to maintain control. The helicopter circled, gunmen ready to fire another volley. But to his left, a narrow side path branched away from the main ravine. It was barely visible, overgrown with scrub. Without hesitation, he steered toward it. The battered pickup clawed its way up the slope, metal grinding. The helicopter shifted position, struggling to keep a clear shot at such a steep angle. Gunfire peppered the ground, missing them by inches. At the top of the incline, the truck burst onto a flat stretch of desert. Smoke billowed from the damaged engine. Another SUV roared into view ahead, headlights blinding. Lucas had no choice. He swerved off to the right, pushing the ailing truck to its limits. The engine sputtered, threatening to stall at any moment. The helicopter was back, searchlight glaring. Margaret's face dripped with sweat, eyes wild with determination. "We can't let them take us," she muttered, half to herself. Suddenly, the engine coughed and died. The truck coasted to a halt in a swirl of dust, the odor of burnt oil thick in the air. A wave of dread washed over Lucas. They were stuck in open ground, the helicopter overhead, and at least two SUVs converging. He grabbed his rifle, turning to Margaret. "We run on foot," he said, though the futility of that plan weighed on him. She clutched the files. "Let's do it." They kicked open the doors, sprinting across the desert. The helicopter's beam locked onto them, a bright spear of light. Gunfire erupted from behind. Lucas returned a burst, forcing the mercenaries to duck. Margaret stumbled, but Lucas caught her arm. Somewhere in the chaos, a new sound emerged, the rumble of an approaching engine from behind a ridge. The helicopter pivoted, uncertain. Headlights appeared, racing at full throttle. Lucas's heart leapt. It was a battered motorcycle, jabbed the handlebars. Hank clung behind him, clearly weakened but upright, a shotgun braced across his lap. "Get down," Hank yelled, voice cracking with effort. Margaret and Lucas dove as Hank fired a single shotgun blast. It was a reckless shot aimed skyward, but the helicopter pilot veered, startled by the unexpected attack. Meanwhile, Jeb skid the bike in a controlled slide, raising a rifle with surprising agility. Bullets whipped toward the mercenaries bounding from their SUVs. Lucas seized the moment, returning fire. Margaret found cover behind a boulder, clutching her cane. Chaos erupted. The helicopter soared overhead, reluctant to hover too low in the face of ground fire. The SUV team scattered, trying to flank Jeb and Hank. Gritting his teeth, Lucas motioned to Margaret, beckoning her to join him behind a rock outcropping. They crawled, bullets zipping overhead. From there, they had a vantage point on one of the SUVs. Lucas's rifle barked, shattering the driver's side window. The occupant bailed out, returning fire blindly. Jeb rolled to a better angle, picking off a mercenary who tried to rush the outcropping. Hank, though pale and trembling, fired the shotgun again, racking it with shaky hands. Each blast echoed across the desert. The helicopter circled, sporadic shots pinging off rocks. But combined fire from Lucas, Jeb, and Hank made it too dangerous for a close approach. The pilot apparently decided to pull back, rising higher, swirling in a wide arc. A furious volley erupted from the remaining mercenaries on the ground, peppering the motorcycle. Jeb cursed, dropping low, while Hank groaned, pressing a hand to his bandaged side. He seemed ready to pass out at any second. Lucas crawled to Jeb's position, shouting over the din, "We're pinned down here." Jeb nodded, sweat streaking his dust-caked face. "Got a plan." Before Lucas could respond, a new set of headlights flared on the horizon. Another wave? Lucas's stomach clenched. They were out of ammunition, out of cover, out of luck. But something was odd about this new arrival. He saw the silhouette of an old ranch truck, battered and rusted. This wasn't typical Red Cliffs gear. The truck fishtailed to a stop not far from the firefight. A group of armed locals emerged, ranchers, by the looks of their clothing and hats. One tall man shouted, "We've had enough of Red Cliffs terrorizing our land." Then he fired a hunting rifle at one of the SUVs. Other ranchers joined in, unleashing a hail of bullets that caught the mercenaries off guard. Shouts of confusion erupted as Red Cliffs found themselves flanked by a small militia of angry locals. Margaret peered over the rock, hope igniting in her eyes. "They came," she whispered, voice shaking. Lucas realized that word had spread. Neighbors and fellow ranchers banding together after hearing of the assault on the Barrett Ranch, refusing to stand by. Outnumbered and sandwiched, the mercenaries began to fall back. The remaining SUV roared to life, spinning away in a cloud of dust. The helicopter angled away, presumably to regroup or flee. Gunfire gradually subsided, replaced by the distant echoes of engines retreating into the desert night. Panting, Lucas slumped against the rock. Margaret sank beside him, clutching the bag of files. Hank nearly collapsed off the motorcycle, only saved by Jeb's quick reflexes. Local ranchers rushed over, checking wounds, offering water. In the midst of the aftermath, Margaret found her voice. "Thank you," she said to the tall rancher, tears slipping down her cheeks. He tipped his hat, eyes full of grim determination. "Couldn't stand by while Red Cliffs bulldozed one of our own." Others nodded in agreement, some spitting in disgust at the fleeing mercenaries. Margaret looked at Lucas, her son. Exhaustion lined both their faces, but a fire of defiance burned in their eyes. The Barrett Ranch might be in ruins, but they had forged a unity among neighbors that Red Cliffs hadn't anticipated. And crucially, they had the documents, proof of Red Cliffs' corruption. An unexpected roar overhead drew their attention. The helicopter was returning, but this time accompanied by the screech of sirens in the distance. A final showdown loomed, with police cruisers blazing down the dirt road. The approaching sirens formed a piercing chorus, flashing red and blue lights dancing across the desert sands. The helicopter circled overhead, its spotlight returning to illuminate the chaotic scene. At the front of the convoy, a sheriff's cruiser fishtailed to a stop, followed by two more. Lucas's stomach churned. He knew from the mercenaries' boast that the local sheriff might be in Red Cliff's pocket. If so, this could go badly for them. Still, the presence of multiple ranchers, armed and defiant, complicated matters. Red Cliffs couldn't just blame the Barretts alone without facing collective outcry. A tall, stout man in a tan uniform and broad-brimmed hat stepped out of the lead cruiser. Sheriff Greer. He rested a hand on his holstered sidearm, eyes scanning the battered group. The ranchers bristled, weapons still in hand, but reluctant to fire on law enforcement. Sheriff Greer's gaze fell on Margaret, recognition sparking. "Mrs. Barrett," he said, voice cool. "Mind telling me what's going on here? We got calls of gunshots, multiple casualties, and a firefight with armed men. Your ranch is half burned, and you're leading a band of locals in a standoff." Margaret leaned on her cane, lifting her chin. The documents were tucked safely in the canvas bag at her side. "You know damn well what's going on, Sheriff. Red Cliffs is illegally seizing land, hiring mercenaries to do their dirty work." Greer's eyes flicked to Lucas, then to the group of ranchers. "That's a serious accusation." A rumble in the sky signaled the helicopter's presence, but it kept a distance now that law enforcement was on the ground. One of the ranchers, a middle-aged woman named Clara, stepped forward. "We witnessed it, Sheriff. They tried to kill Margaret here. Shot up her ranch, set fires, threatened us all." Another rancher nodded, brandishing his rifle. "We can't stand by while a corporation runs roughshod over our county." Sheriff Greer shifted his stance, tension radiating. "We have to follow procedures. If you have evidence, bring it to the station. But for now, put down your guns." Margaret's grip tightened on her cane. "We do have evidence," she retorted, removing the file from the canvas bag and holding it aloft. "Land deeds, financial records, bribes, collusion with county officials. It's all here." Greer's expression flickered, a trace of alarm crossing his face. Lucas observed closely. This was the moment of truth. If Greer was truly in Redcliffe's pocket, he might try to confiscate the files or discredit Margaret. Yet a hush fell over the crowd. Ranchers parted as Margaret handed the folder to Clara. "Make copies. Spread them everywhere. Media, politicians, anyone who'll listen. Even if we don't have local justice, we'll have public opinion on our side." The sheriff's jaw clenched. "Now hold on." Clara nodded firmly, pivoting away to pass the files around. The crowd murmured, reading the damning documents under the glow of headlights and flashlights. Pages showed bank transfers, forged signatures, county official payoffs. Lucas felt a surge of triumph. It was all real, indisputable proof. Deputies emerged from their cruisers, some uncertain. One older deputy, hat in hand, approached Margaret gently. "Ms. Barrett, let's get you checked out by an ambulance. Looks like you've been hurt." His tone was polite, almost deferential, signaling that not every lawman was compromised. Margaret wobbled, exhaustion finally catching up. Lucas eased an arm around her, supporting her weight. "We'll all need medical attention," he said wearily, nodding at Hank, who lay reclined on the motorcycle, face pale. The sheriff glared at the ranchers, frustration mounting. He seemed unsure how to proceed without incriminating himself. Just then, the helicopter performed one last sweep and departed, its rotor noise fading into the distance. Redcliffe's men, seeing the tide turn against them, had chosen to retreat rather than risk a confrontation with an agitated local militia and a suspicious police force. Eventually, paramedics arrived. Lights from more emergency vehicles bathed the desert in a surreal glow. Margaret, Hank, and several injured ranchers received medical care on the spot. Lucas let out a long breath, tension seeping from his body. For the first time, he felt a cautious sense of victory. Sheriff Greer tried to maintain control, but as more people read the documents, public outrage swelled. Ranchers demanded answers. Local journalists arrived, cameras flashing. The sheriff found himself in the hot seat, forced to defend his department's actions. Meanwhile, the county commissioners who had sided with Redcliffe's faced an avalanche of accusations. Margaret stood on shaky legs, wrapped in a blanket a paramedic had given her. The sun rose behind her, casting a golden light over the scorched ranch. She turned to Lucas, voice thick with emotion. "We did it," she said softly. "We took back our land, or at least we will." Lucas nodded, heart full. "It's not over yet. Redcliffe's won't give up easily." She looked toward the horizon, eyes glimmering. "No, but now they have the entire county against them. And we have the truth on our side." Lucas's gaze fell on the shattered remains of the farmhouse, the charred barn. Memories flooded him. Childhood laughter, arguments, heartbreak. This land held every chapter of his life, both painful and precious. He felt Margaret's hand slip into his, her old calloused fingers squeezing gently. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears staining the dust on her cheeks. "For pushing you away. For not reaching out sooner." He bent his head, grief and relief mingling. "I left because I thought I'd protect you from my own darkness. But in the end, you needed me here, not gone." She reached up, touching the bandage on his brow, the result of the firefight. "We both made mistakes. Let's not waste any more time." As the morning sun climbed higher, they surveyed the land. Paramedics helped Hank into an ambulance, while Jeb, stoic and silent, exchanged words with other ranchers, already planning how to rebuild. News vans arrived, capturing footage of the battered property. Reporters clamored for statements, but Margaret waved them off for the moment, her priority resting with her injured friends and neighbors. Sheriff Greer, under mounting pressure, was forced to question the Red Cliff security personnel who had been detained or hospitalized. Criminal charges were filed. A corruption investigation was launched. Word spread that Red Cliff's executives were scrambling to control the damage, facing lawsuits and public outrage. In the weeks that followed, the county commissioners were removed or resigned in disgrace, indicted on multiple counts of bribery and conspiracy. Red Cliff's expansion project halted under federal scrutiny. Media outlets latched onto the story of a small community standing against corporate tyranny, leonizing Margaret and her son as local heroes. Hank recovered slowly, regaining some of his strength with daily visits from Nurse Rita. Jeb stayed by his side, a loyal friend who had proven his courage. The local ranchers began organizing a legal fund to restore Margaret's property and challenge other questionable land deals across the region. For Lucas, the days turned into a blur of rebuilding. He oversaw the clearing of debris, coordinated deliveries of new lumber, repaired fences, and helped bury the remains of the barn. Through it all, he felt a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced in years. The shadowy world of covert operations, the ghosts of his past missions, all seemed distant now. Late one afternoon, as the sun burned low and crimson over the horizon, Margaret joined Lucas by the fence line. Cattle grazed timidly nearby, returning after the chaos. The ranch still bore scars, charred timbers, blackened earth, but signs of life were emerging. Margaret leaned on her cane, gazing at the pastel sky. "When your father passed, I thought I had to be as strong as steel to keep this place going," she said softly. "But steel can break if it doesn't bend. I learned that the hard way." Lucas rested an arm on her shoulder. "We bend together," he answered, heart full. She smiled, eyes moist. "I'm proud of you, son. And I know Henry would be too. You came home when we needed you most." They stood there in peaceful silence, the last rays of sunlight painting the ranch in golden hues. Off in the distance, a newly raised frame of a barn stood partially built, a testament to resilience. The land had seen violence and heartbreak, but it would endure, carried forward by a mother and her son who'd fought to protect it, and by the community they inspired. Months later, the Barrett Ranch stood restored, a fresh coat of paint on the house, a sturdy new barn rising from the ashes. Lawsuits against Red Cliffs piled up, and the corporation's executives retreated from the county under immense public pressure. A newly elected sheriff took office, vowing to protect local interests. Margaret Barrett walked her land each morning, cane tapping the ground, greeting the animals and the ranch hands who returned. She aged another year in that time, but something in her spirit felt younger, revitalized by hope. Hank had regained enough strength to drive around on a tractor, grin flashing whenever he passed by. As for Lucas, he found solace in daily ranch chores. He and his mother shared dinners, sometimes silent, sometimes filled with laughter. The estrangement between them had melted away in the crucible of their shared struggle. One dusk, as Lucas finished stacking hay bales in the new barn, Margaret called out to him. "Come inside, son," she said from the open door. "Supper's ready." He set down a bale, rubbing the sweat from his brow. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in amber. From where he stood, he could see the fence line where they'd first fought off mercenaries. He remembered the raging fire, the bullet holes, the fear, and he felt gratitude for the calm that had followed. With a deep breath, he followed his mother inside. The Barrett Ranch was at peace for now. And though there would always be shadows from his past, Lucas felt anchored by the land that had shaped him and by the family bond renewed in adversity.